Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Good to see you all. I want to remind everybody, thank you, to turn off your cell phones. And we're going to get started. We have a very exciting program today. My name is Greg Mancios. Let me start off with that. My name is Greg Mancios. I'm the founding dean of the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Study, which publishes New Labor Forum. I want to welcome all of you who are here in person, as well as those of you who are joining us via Zoom. We have about 400 registrants who are joining us for this celebration. And through the magic of the internet, they're coming to us from all over the country and in some cases, other parts of the world. I am often asked how we came up with the idea of a labor college. And I tell the story about sitting in a bar in Flushing with a couple of labor leaders and literally outlining a plan on the back of a doily, like they do in all those labor stories. But more recently, I've been asked about how we came up with the idea of a labor journal. So you want to know? I was going to tell you anyway. Okay, so we started talking about a school in 1984, but if you fast forward to 1997, we're not in a bar now, but we're in a car. We're in my old Taurus, Ford Taurus. And in the car with me are two other individuals. One is Arthur Chiotis, then president of CWA Local 1180, and still chair of our labor advisory board. And the third person in the car was Ed Ott, who was at that time the director of public policy for the Central Labor Council, and a few years later became head of the Central Labor Council. We were coming back from Albany, or on the New York State Thruway, and we had just finished a very long day of lobbying. When we were doing that, we would get up at 5:30 in the morning, spend all day walking the halls of the legislative building there, and we were lobbying for money for this labor program that was at Queens College. And now, this was 13 hours after leaving New York, and it's a long drive, and we were literally just trying to keep each other awake on this long drive. And out of the blue, literally out of the blue, Ed Ott blurts out, we ought to start a labor journal. And we literally spent the rest of the night talking about what a journal would look like. And the very next morning, I sat down with Paula Finn, and she had just joined us maybe a few months earlier as director of what we then called the Labor Resource Center at Queens College. And that started a 6-month conversation about what it would be like to have a new labor journal. So what did we articulate at the time? We wanted a journal that provides space for academics and unionists to come together and explore new ideas. We wanted a journal that was independent, that was lively, and most important, readable. We wanted scholars to read it, but we also wanted labor leaders and shop stewards and rank and file workers to read it as well. And while the focus was going to be on labor issues, we wanted to put race, gender, as well as class at the forefront of everything we did in the journal. And we wanted a cultural section as well. We wanted bread and we wanted roses. There was more. We wanted a journal that was not afraid to tackle tough questions. In fact, those were precisely the questions that we wanted to address. We wanted a journal that was not afraid to publish ideas, even if they were ideas we didn't agree with. In fact, we would seek out a wide variety of ideas, including those that we thought were provocative. In other words, we wanted to encourage debate. And that's precisely why we baked into the title of the journal, a journal of ideas, analysis, and debate. And that phrase remains with us on our masthead ever since. We self-published in the beginning. We didn't have much money, and we didn't know how long it would last, because magazines and journals at that time were just disappearing left and right, literally left and right. And so we took a bit of a chance. But here we are a quarter of a century later, and we have over 20,000 subscribers worldwide. You know, who would have thunk? Truly amazing. From my perspective, I never in my wildest dreams would imagine this. So all this is been successful due to a lot of people, the hundreds of authors who've contributed to the journal. We thank them. We thank the editors, the associate editors, consulting editors, contributing editors. We have a lot of editors, but that's what makes the journal what it is. The faculty from SLU who have helped us so much with articles and suggestions and leads and proofreading. We thank the staff that makes all of this possible. All of this, however, was accomplished under the stewardship of Paula Finn, who served for 25 years as editor-in-chief. Unfortunately, and it pains me to say this, but Paula is stepping down as editor in April. And she's doing it for probably the only reason I couldn't argue with. And that was because she wants to pursue her poetry full time. Those of you who know Paula know that poetry is her true love. That is second only to not the least and their children. But it has been part of Paula and who she is for almost her entire life. And those of you who know Paula also know that she disdains public praise. And that's why she gave me only 4.5 minutes up here. And she probably thinks I already said too much. But the truth of the matter is that there is no way to fully acknowledge and thank her for her leadership. There's simply no way to do justice to acknowledge her contribution, not only to the journal, but to the School of Labor and Urban Studies. So I will simply say, Paula, thank you, and thank you. I'd like to ask you to come up and author to come up here, just stand up a minute. And if Ed Ott were here, he couldn't join us today, but I would ask him to be up here as well. I think we have, yeah. Yeah. So since I can't say anything more, the only thing I can do is give you a small snippet about appreciation. Fortunately, we have a lot more time. I'm going to turn the podium over to you in a minute, but Arthur, my friend, there is no way to thank you properly for your leadership and your support over these really almost 40 years, even before the journal was born. And yeah, I think perhaps we learned a lot of lessons over the last 35, 40 years working together, but maybe one of them is that, we should nobody should ever underestimate what can be accomplished with a few good ideas, especially late at night on the highway in a car. So Arthur, thank you, my friend, for everything you've done. And this is just a small, a small token of our appreciation. And Arthur, if you can say a few words, we love it.
Okay. Well, it's been a labor of love. It's been a passion. As a product of the City University, I realized how important the university was to giving working class people the opportunity to move into the middle class. And it gave me that. And more importantly, when I became a labor leader, I realized that not everyone had the opportunity that I had. And that we needed to establish programs that achieved that. And what I also saw was that the media wasn't really discussing labor issues. We needed to have a forum to discuss our issues, to exchange our ideas, to bring in the scholars and bring in the rank and file people and talk about what's really important in our lives. We have a lot of work to do. The direction of this country is frightful, and it is real. And unless we come together with the right ideas and reach out to as many people as possible, as this journal has done, we will face some tough times ahead, as if we haven't had them enough. And so I would urge all of you to take the advice that's in the first article that's in the, I wrote it down, from Samir Santi, who talks about who pays for inflation. He said this: the only force that stands a chance of restructuring or transcending capitalism as we know it is an organized working class with a radical political view. Are we ready? Let's make sure this school is ready to train that generation to carry on that fight. And I thank you, Greg, for your leadership, for your commitment as the founding dean to reach out and find people like Paul and his faculty and much of the staff that you see here today. Realizing sometimes when you're the boss, the best thing you can do is get out of the way, because you have some brilliant people in this who work for SOU, on the faculty, on the staff, who are making a difference in people's lives. And I'm so proud to have done what I could. And right now, our big thing is to make sure we can grow SLU and get more working people to understand what's really going on in this world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arthur. This, I don't know if Eddie is on the Zoom call or not, but Eddie, I don't know if you're out there on Zoom, but this one is for you. So now we turn to the program. Today we'll be talking about the past 25 years and during the period that the journal was published, and we are going to try and envision the next 25 years. So without further ado, I want to bring Paula Finn up to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg and Arthur and Ed, for founding the journal and for providing your wholehearted support for many, many years. It's really that's made this possible. In one further round of thank you before we begin with the program, I want to ask Anita Palathingal Nadia Rahman and Kitty Krupat to stand up. They are the folks who work on the editorial staff and bring our authors to their very best light. And they do it with great skill and a lot of dedication. So thank you. I want to thank folks for attending in person today. It feels great to see you, and we've got over 200 people who are joining us virtually right now. In keeping with the tradition of the journal, we're going to open today's program with poetry. We decided always to bring poetry and artwork into the journal so as to bring the songs and the dances, the tears, and the wit of workers and working class communities into the conversations we host about politics and society. Many of you may not know this, but we're in a kind of a golden age of working class poetry in the United States. The number, the prominence, and the diversity of writers writing about work and working class life is greater than it has ever been. And you're going to get a taste of that when you hear from Patrick Rosal, who I will tell you about. Patrick is the author of 5 full-length poetry collections, including Brooklyn Antediluvian, which won the Academy of American Poets Lenore Marshall Prize for Best Book of Poetry. And he wrote The Last Thing, New and Selected Poems, which was the winner of the William Carlos Williams Award. He's currently professor of English and campus co-director of the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice at Rutgers. I turn it over to you, Patrick.
Thank you. It's so great to be here. You know, there is a kind of golden age happening right now, but writers and poets and artists, we can kind of get caught in our own little world. So it's an honor to be among folks thinking about work and about working class people in this particular moment. I thought that I would, when Paula published my poem in New Labor Forum, I've been published in some pretty great magazines. When I ended up in New Labor Forum, I was like, man, that is cool. So it's a little star for me to be in New Labor Forum. So thank you so much, Paula, and I wish you all the best in your own work. So I thought that I would open up with the poem that is in the journal. It's called Typhoon Poem. I was on a Fulbright to the Philippines when Typhoon Undoy hit. At that time, they thought, oh, this is a 100-year storm, and then Haiyan followed maybe a year or two after that. Absolutely devastating storm. Both of them were, and we continue to see them around the world. And this is based on something that a story that somebody had told me immediately after that storm hit. Typhoon Poem. The teacher can't hear the children over all this monsoon racket. The zillion spoons whacking the rusty roofs. The wicked tin streams flipping full-grown bucks off their hooves. Everywhere there used to be a river, there's a bigger river now. Every hard face on the block is sopping, even the court where girls from St. Ignominius ran the roughneck boys off to play their own 3-on-3 in plaid skirts and church shoes for cash. Forget it. The whole city's a flash flood with brawn enough to flush trucks sideways down the capital's widest drives. The crushed tonnage bobs around a bit at the foot of some Spanish bastard statue before it stalls and pools on white church steps. Brute pilgrims, face it. Paddling dogs won't make it. So children got no shot, but quick thinking. This teacher lashes her students 2 at a time with wire and stray twine. She binds them across their breasts to trees and metal posts, lining the streets, half-flooded walk. No goddamn way, she swears, she won't let one little one be washed out, even if their wriggling makes their armpits bleed. They'll have to make peace with the vision of their uncles and neighbors' blue bodies bumping past before they fishtail out of sight. You can't wish away the deluge. You can't vanish the bloated carnage waters. But the tykes in crew cuts and pigtails, still fastened to shafts and trunks in ragged rows, will survive. For now, their teacher has made them safe by building an orchard of them in the middle of a city road. This small chorus of young, hard fruit, this little grove moaning. Thank you. I was born in Belleville, New Jersey. I grew up, my family's from all over, Chicago, Philippines, Chicago, Toronto, Brooklyn, and then we spent most of our time in New Jersey. Edison, specifically, if I could share a little bit. I grew up late 70s and 80s as a B-boy. So I was a breaker. I used to break downtown at the Roxy. And as a DJ. I actually got challenged to a battle on the street. I read this same poem last Saturday night, and this old head challenged me. I'm warning you, I still got it, so don't do it. But you know, we used to have these DJ battles, and you know, there were these really fancy turntables. We still got them, called the Techniques 1200s, which were like, those were like the gold standard of DJing turntables. And of course, we couldn't afford them. So, you know, they were like, back in the 80s, they were like $400, $500 a pop, you know? So we would go to Sam Goody and get the cheap turntables. And then we would convert them. We would turn them into battle-ready turntables. Now, the reason why it's significant, if I can share a little bit of the history, is that my parents are from the Philippines. Our whole DJ crew was from the Philippines, and we were in Edison, New Jersey. As you know, Edison, among his many marketed inventions, was what would eventually become the turntable. Edison was also pro-imperialist, right? So you could just go on the Library of Congress and see all the films that he made, as they were essentially propagandist films in order to justify the invasion and the colonization of the Philippines. So what great glee I take in looking back at my youth and our intuitive sense to take this machine, which was used. You can check out Christine Balance, who's at Cornell. She does really beautiful work in her book, talking about how these recordings, these Edison recordings, these record players, there's photos of Filipinos listening like the RCA dog to the master's voice. How this was an instrument of empire, essentially. And so here we were, 14, 15, 16, 17-year-old kids taking apart this instrument of empire and dancing. A scavenger's ode to the turntable, AKA a note to Thomas Alva Edison. We lifted the precious arm first, then the platter. We pulled free the belt and unscrewed the top. I didn't take shop or build a whole lot by hand, but I was pretty good with a knife. I poked the half-dull blade clean and gentle through the turntable's plastic. I sawed down 4 inches straight as I could make it. Me and my boys, sons of cops, bookkeepers, and ex-priests, picked up gear other DJs didn't want no more. One prep school kid who just bought a shiny new mixer tossed out his 2-month-old Newmark, which we picked from the garbage and hoisted home. We harvested the slider from the rich kid's rig. I stripped the wires tips and soldered them to pitch contacts in a basement of a maple split in Edison, New Jersey. We were learning to turn anything into anything else. While our mothers played mahjong in the sala and our fathers bet slow horses and the government bombed Iraq, we learned to poise pennies on the cartridge head so the diamond stylus would sit deep in the vinyl's groove. A dance floor could turn from whining to riot quick if a record skipped when we spun back the wax to its cue. We stayed awake from noon to noon, digging out from crates some forgotten voice or violin to scratch. We juggled and chirped. We perfected the grind of a downbeat and dropped it on the bass line coming round, half trash, half hallelujah. Our hands cut Bach to Bambata and made a dance hall jump. We held one ear to the syncopated kick and the other to a future music that no one else could hear. Out of a hunk of rescued junk, we built a machine to mix the classics. We faded and transformed. We chopped up masters and made the whole block bounce. Thank you. I too hear the call for us to get together, make a lot of noise. This will be my last poem. Thank you again, Paula. Thank you all for all your work. Ars Poetica, after a dog. Here is a sex shop and a Bible shop 2 doors down. Between them, a sick hound roams. Let's suppose it. There is also a 2-family house where 3 families live across the street from a deli and this check cashing shack with a rabbit hutch out back. Any of these may have been burned down twice. Let's suppose this is America. Over the years, we have become the kind of tribe that has forgotten how it trades over chess and chit chat, a mango or Jesus honey for 9. Now, we thank God the Almighty, we don't know what it's like to be close to one another. Donald, the idiot, for example, feeds this sick dog flowers, and we watch him. But then, suppose 2 or 20 of us more hear a sound, some familiar din, far off tambourines, children's laughter, though a bit dark like bell on bone, and it simply grows until we are looking at each other wide-eyed with this small thrill calling us out, this handsome buzzsaw racket, this rhythm that bores the air, a gurdy hum. What if our numbers suddenly flood a small stretch of oiled turnpike or dried out meadow? What kind of sound is this that rallies us all from precinct to nook? What noise to muster tremors from King James and hustler alike? What uproar, what raucous fuss in every American vicinity? And I know you don't believe any human noise can call us together per se, but listen, suppose we are moved, summoned, you, me, and the rest of us who want to know something about everything we've outlived by hullabaloo, We gather, beckoned, not too far from the XXX store and the Bible store, not too far at all for Donald to carry in his sleeves the scent of mongrel or bad cheese or onion skin and cheap ink. And you and I and Donald and all stand elbow to elbow, this small throng of the ordinary, armed for once with our full wits. And no, let us not say it is a singing, but say this sound as we approach gets stranger and stranger, so much so we mistake it for ourselves. It has the bony rattle of dice-quick wrists, the abundance of olives and lakeshore sand. It resembles the scripture and curse. You and I in dim-lit squares and dance floor muck and crawfish mud and dance hall wine in broken bed and graveyard bliss have been grinding for all our lives. This joyful wind into jubilance, so no vector of bullet or blade could fleck the soggy pale neck of a boy offered to God. No, what if this sound that is not a singing becomes one by one the lot of us improbable, us gorgeously common, us tunes contagion? What if us do sing with sand caught in our teeth, mango dripping from our mouths, Jesus honey wild? What if the very knives start clanging too? What if those first no song strains open the sex shop, neon in us, musk in us, whiskey stinks so deep down in us, we sing like this, so funky, so loud we refuse to neglect what ramshackle bunkhouse, penthouse, whorehouse we were drawn from in the first place, and how the hell we will ever find our way back. Even so, let's not forget the long yelp of the poor dog who ate fresh petals. Some moron savant force-fed it, having spent 3 full spring days stitching them together with metal bars. What if no one recalls that sound except the few surviving dogs? The twisted thin wire fence and the silent magnolia blast every May, I say, let us not slip back through the dark to sting and peck our beloveds with more than our usual misdeeds. I say, let us not forget a sick hound's metallic hack and skirl, for Donald has found a few more dogs to feed his barbed garlands to. And before we count ourselves among the blessed, let's say we ain't done yet howling into great tombs, ain't yet done cracking necks. Let's say this once and for all, for kicks, we won't taste sulfur at the end of a fuse. When one is born, when one dies, when one steals a moldy loaf of bread, this is how it is. The dildos go on sale. In the rabbit hutch, a snake. We've played checkers with all the pawns. But if there have been any lies, we're sure to let everyone know now what they are and who started them. Some of us will not get fed, but let's listen, spooning in the dark for laughter. For if we're lucky, sometimes both the darkness and the laughter are our own. This is America. We've no choice but sing in multitude, no better than the soul of a wrongly punished dog. May God for once not grant us many more things as foolish as that, given the way we ruin our guts on rusted steel and bloom. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Patrick has told me he may need to leave fairly soon because this event today comes smack dab in the middle of the nation's largest poetry event, which is the Geraldine R. Dodge Poetry Festival taking place in Newark. So he may need to take off for that. That's a 10-stage, many thousand people. If anybody had any doubts that we're over with the COVID pandemic, I think today's event will put those doubts to rest. I'm afraid to say that we've got a couple of speakers who came down with COVID, first of whom is Steve Fraser, historian and author, who is the person who worked with me for 20 years, editing and shaping every aspect of the journal. He was going to moderate this first forum, and I am going to take his place, but we'll all miss Steve. Adolph Reed as well was going to be with us and has also got COVID, so he is not with us either. To frame this panel, I thought I'd reflect a little bit about the journal and the history that it's tracked over the past 25 years. In September 1997, the first issue of the journal was rolling off the presses and announcing a growing sense of revival after labor's decades-long decline. Hope was palpable then. Many of us will remember. It was in the wake of the Sweeney election, the first contested election at the AFL-CIO. And the Sweeney leadership was promising mass organizing and a rapprochement with labor's estranged allies, folks from the civil rights movement, feminists, public intellectuals, and scholars. It gave labor activists and all of us, even people around the globe, cause for optimism. The Sweeney leadership would bring an end to the Labor Federation's decades-long connection with anti-communism. Since the early 1950s under George Meany and Lane Kirkland, the Federation had been closely aligned with neoliberal domestic and international policies. And although a number of unions in the Federation were strong supporters of the civil rights movement and social justice movements, the Federation itself had managed to undermine labor's New Deal coalitions. The Fed did not, in fact, formally endorse the 1963 March on Washington. About the Vietnam War, George Meany offered Lyndon Johnson his unstinting commitment to the burgeoning troops. As deindustrialization was taking off around the country in the 1970s and unionized manufacturing was increasingly moving offshore, the Federation also failed to take on the task of organizing the burgeoning service sector. So partly as a result of all that, union density began its long decline. The Sweeney administration and the New Voice leadership were intent upon reversing all this. The House of Labor under new administration began to open its doors to intellectuals, to civil rights organizations and radicals. And many of us were celebrating. And it was in this ferment that New Labor Forum announced itself as an independent forum, welcoming a variety of viewpoints to provoke and inform new thinking on labor issues and working class life. So while suffused with optimism, that first issue of the journal also pointed to the difficulties that lay ahead. And in fact, by the early 2000s, it became clear that for a variety of reasons, the mass organizing hoped for under the Sweeney administration would really mostly not materialize. The contributors to New Labor Forum would go on to explore failed attempts to unionize Walmart, dashed efforts to unionize foreign auto in the South. In 2003, we published a proposal that had the effect of spurring what would become ultimately a fruitless disaffiliation from the AFL-CIO by unions committed to spending major resources on mass organizing. Our authors continued to track the long decline in union and ongoing decline in union density, simultaneous to the growth of what became known as the working poor. The wealth gap between rich and poor came to exceed that of the Gilded Age, and right-wing nationalism began to spread among working class in Europe and the United States. And of course, the mind-boggling wealth of e-commerce behemoths, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Walmart, which have remained really largely unregulated, took off with massive profiteering from the surveillance of consumers. And of course, the climate peril continued to deepen, mostly without response from large unions who remained mostly on the sidelines in terms of calling for large-scale conversion to renewables. So here we are. But after all, it wasn't all doom and gloom. Protest movements and civil actions rose up as well to protect working class people and workers endangered on many fronts. And New Labor Forum authors went on to examine that as well. There was the massive 2006 Immigrant Rights March, nationwide Occupy Wall Street protests, LGBTQ+ organizing, the rise and expansive growth of Black Lives Matter, and then the Red for Ed teachers strikes in 2018 and 2019. Finally, in 2021, beginning with a month that's become known by many of us as Striketober, this organizing reached a tipping point. Walkouts began to surge nationwide at major companies, Nabisco, John Deere, Kaiser Permanente, Chipotle, and organizing took off too at Starbucks, in digital media, museums, Google, fiber contractors, Verizon retail workers, and even congressional staffers in our capital. Amazon, of course, that 20th century behemoth whose long arm steers the entire economy, succumbed to the stalwart organizing of warehouse workers on Staten Island. So once again, many of us are beginning to feel that hope is in the air. Increasing numbers of workers and people of color, young people, have decided not to take it lying down, and segments of the country are cheering them on. During the COVID pandemic, of course, low-wage workers, and particularly workers of color, experienced the bitter irony of being lauded as essential, but treated as expendable. Simultaneously, the tightened labor market gave a lot of workers a greater sense of confidence. And with the symptoms of racialized capitalism on really full display through the caging of migrant workers, the continued murder of Black people at the hands of cops, the horrors of school massacres and other mass murders, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, all gave rise to a kind of melding of economic justice and social justice movements. Back in 1996, when we were assembling the first issue of New Labor Forum, a teach-in was taking place at Columbia University with nearly 2,000 people in attendance. New Labor Forum editor Steve Fraser played a major role in that historic gathering, as did Nelson Lichtenstein, who's here with us today, editorial board member, and others. Speakers at that forum included Cornel West, Betty Friedan, John Sweeney, many others, speaking about the potential for revitalizing organizing. At that teach-in, Betty Friedan said, my Geiger counter is clicking. I've got a good Geiger counter, and it was clicking at the beginning of the labor movement, enough to tell me that that was getting off the ground. And it's clicking again today about labor organizing. While many of us feel our Geiger counter is beginning to click again today, I think that's kind of a cautionary tale. Social justice and economic justice movements are hard to sustain. New Labor Forum, though, is doubling down on its commitment to keep close track of all of these developments and to continue to offer strategic proposals, research, in order to make sure we make the most of them, and that our Geiger counters are predicting what they're predicting comes true. I want to turn it over now to our speakers and introduce them in the order in which they will speak. I'm looking for my notes here. I want to say that each one of them has written often for the journal. I don't need notes for you guys anyway. So we're gonna start with Stephen Lerner, a lifelong labor activist who has worked with the farm workers, ILGWU, and in 1986 joined the Service Employees International Union and became well known as the groundbreaking architect of the Justice for Janitors movement. He's now at Georgetown at the Kalmanovitz Institute, and he's going to start us off, but let me introduce everybody and then you can just come on up. Phil Thompson is the former deputy mayor for strategic initiatives in the de Blasio administration and has returned now to MIT, where he does urban policy. And he's the author of, tell me the Black Mayors. Yeah. And writes frequently for the Journal as well. Ruth Milkman is a distinguished professor of sociology at the Grad Center and the chair of labor studies here at the School of Labor and Urban Studies. She has written, I don't know, over 8 books on a wide variety of labor topics. And she also serves as consulting editor on the Journal as well as a frequent author. So great.
Hold on. A little taller than you. This working now? This good? Hey, everybody. Before I get started, I want to embarrass Paula also, since we started off with that, which is, in addition to the great work that was described, for me personally, Paula has asked me to write many times and has been an incredible editor and really helped my thinking. And so I just want to say the process of writing, and I often do group writing with other people, has really been extraordinary in shaping my thinking. So I just wanted to thank you for all of that I know I need to aim at the mics here. I want to just thank you for all of that over the years, because it's really been wonderful. And my own development, it's really helped me think. So I just wanted to thank you for that. And also to say that Paula, in the winter issue, asked Marilyn Snyderman and me to write an article about what's going on in labor. And being that combined, we have like 80 years of being in the labor movement. We've been going through history and remembering everything. And it's been quite a journey to look back at all the things that we've tried. But before I get started, I just wanted to take an informal poll of the group here, because the theme of this meeting is a working class resurgence. So I just like to see who thinks that this is a potential moment of working class resurgence, honestly. Who thinks, or is, okay, whatever. Who thinks this is a moment of working class or potential, I'm going to be liberal here, or potential working class resurgence? Okay. Who thinks most unions are ready to seize this moment? Okay, just making sure I'm in the right room here, folks. Who thinks that a lot of unions who have a lot of resources really won't change at this time? Who thinks neoliberalism is in crisis? Neoliberalism in crisis. I have many other questions. I just wanted to start off with that just to get my head situated. So I'm going to try to cover a lot of ground in the 15 minutes that Paul has given me to cover the last 40 years of the labor movement. And so I just want to lay out a couple of the points I'm going to hit first, just in case I don't get to them, because I see we have real timekeepers here. And in the first, and because of what Paul has said, I'm not going to have to say a lot about it. This is absolutely a moment of great hope and opportunity, but we also need to be clear, incredible peril. And I'll come back to that. But the thing is, we've been through a lot of moments like this before, and I want to come back to that. The times that we thought this was it. And so I want to come to that. And then I also want to talk about what we've learned from successes and failure, some of the internal and external obstacles to winning. And then I really want to focus on justice for janitors in union cities and what lessons we can pull out of those for this current moment. And then finally, I want to touch on, is bargaining for common good a vehicle for doing some of this? But when we predict, is this the moment? I feel almost like this is like this. Is this the moment? Is this the moment? It's like the Middle Ages when they take the carcasses and the entrails of dead animals and they would try to read the future by shifting them. And so I feel some trepidation in being optimistic or saying, this is it, folks, because I guess a broken watch is right twice a day, because I sort of for every year for 40 years have been saying, this is it, we're going to do it, the movement's going to go. So having said all of that, clearly you took the first part of my remarks. There's lots of incredible stuff going on. But I just want to remember as we think about that, read you a couple headlines that have come out over the years. I got to put on my glasses for this, sorry. So there is a headline, and I think it's from 1980, New York Times, growth of unions forecast, increased militancy predicted. Then in the South Florida Sentinel, 1995, greatly weakened labor union shows sign of making comeback. Then there's a Steve Greenhouse 1998 article saying biggest union drive since 1936. That was the home care victory in California, I think. I'm not going to read them all, but there's all these quotes and they're like ringing in my head because so many times we've seen, is this it? Is something really going to happen here? And so I just want to focus on just remembering that it's what you said, that something's cooking, but we've blown it in the past. And we need to understand how much of that was external, how much of that it was just the times we're in, and what do we learn from all of this? And when we talk about the peril, again, I'll be very brief, because we're on the edge of fascism. And we just need to be clear on that. Because the choice here is not, do we organize workers or not organize workers? The choice here is, are we building a multiracial movement for feminist democracy that's going to transform this country? And we can't do that without organizing, without unions. But if our goal is just to get members, we're not just approaching the crisis that we face in the country. So I have a whole long thing, and you're going to get to read this all in detail in the article, which I'm summarizing, but I will say that Paul has been very kind. We started at 3,000 words, then we were at 3,500 words. It kept growing. So I will not attempt, and she kept cutting it back, and we kept adding, but I now figured that was just negotiations. I didn't, and you lost, because she'd send us the edits and she'd make one little comment. Could you add something in this? So that was another 10 pages. But anyway, back to my notes. I'm in a silly mood. So I just think it's worth thinking about some of the things that were tried over the years. Some of you may know, you mentioned some, but there was the Organizing Institute. Can we train people how to organize in a different way? Then there was something called the Blitz strategy developed by Richard Bensinger, which is, can you run elections faster than the boss can run anti-union campaigns? Other people did hot shops, organizing anything that moves. Some of us argued for strategic campaigns, but there was all different experimentation, each one of which was exciting. We thought it might be the breakthrough and wasn't. And then there were even things like called acting like a union. Let's just forget whether we get certified, we do anything. If we have power on the shop floor, we have power. So I'm not going to go through them all, but there's a couple others. Have anybody here heard of bargaining to organize as a strategy? Bargaining for organize was the idea that if a company's partially unionized, let's leverage our contracts to grow and not just settle for what we have. So there were all these things tried, and CWA, SEIU, Unite Here did all sorts of bargaining for a common good and got card check recognitions and grew in huge number. Well, I don't know if they grew, they organized lots of people. So we did all these all these different things. But in the end, when I started in the labor movement in 74, I think there were 20 million members and 20% of the workforce. So was unionized. And now after a lifetime in the labor movement, we've done a good job. We've got it down to a manageable size. So I say all of this with some humility because, especially for the younger folks in the room, you could look around and say, great, I have this guy that's been doing this for 40 years and we're losing and he's telling us what we should do. So, and it'd be a fair enough critique. But anyway, so what I wanted to think about, and then, and the other thing that we also really developed in that period was this idea of capital strategies. Who's heard of that? Anybody? It's the idea that workers' capital, our pension funds, are what feeds much of the economy. And I consider what happens with that money assisted suicide, which is money is taken out of our checks to then put into pension plans that then invest in things that are really terrible for workers. And so there's all these different things going on in the context of the rise of neoliberalism. And the point being that we were going against the stream, against the tide. So as I think of many of the things that we tried, we need to think about, did they fail because we did them wrong? Did they fail execution? Did they fail because it was the wrong moment? Was it the wrong idea? But we need to look back at all of that, because if we're in a moment of potential resurgence, then this isn't ancient history to try to understand what some of us tried. And one of the key tenets of this for some of us was saying that we needed to organize whole sectors and whole industries if we were to really exercise power, that the goal of the union wasn't just to add members, but it was to radically change and transform jobs. And so that thinking of organizing whole sectors was in an article, I think published in New Labor Forum, called, what was it called? A New Architecture for Labor, Remodeling, something like that, which came out. And while you said it led to a split in labor, it is important if you reread it to note that I actually did not argue for a split in labor. I actually argued in the article to build something in the shell of the old, which is an important point because that's where I'm going to end today. Little thing just to connect the dots for you. Anyway, but that article, I just reread it. And if you all haven't seen it, it's worth rereading because I think so much of it is still true. It talked about the structure of labor and teeny competing unions. It went through why it's so difficult to move people together. It went through failed strategies. Anyway, I won't go through it all, but I think it's really worth reading because I was struck because now the AFL is talking about what it's going to do. People didn't hear, they just did a per capita increase. They're going to set up something called the Center for Transformational Organizing. So it was sort of interesting to look back on what we said and tried. But the two things that I think I take a lot of lessons out of, who knows the Justice for Janitors campaign? Yeah. Is that Justice for Janitors was born in the moment of the deepest, darkest days in the labor movement, when people had really, in many cases, given up. And it was born out of, it was the original part of SEIU. It was what built SEIU, the Building Service Workers. And all over the country, we were getting devastated. Locals were getting crushed, there were concessions. And literally the union had made a decision to give up, except for New York, Chicago, and San Francisco. They said it's hopeless. Workers are part-time, they're undocumented, et cetera, et cetera. They work for contractors and the real estate industry. And I think this is an important lesson for this moment. Part of the reason we were successful is because the union had given up so that we then had incredible freedom to try new things. No, seriously, that it's because there was no hope that they'd let a 29-year-old, which is how old I was at the time, start something called Justice for Janitors. And I just want to cover a couple things that became key to that strategy. One is that we needed to understand the industry that we were in. Meaning we were organizing cleaning contractors, but the real target was the building owners who hire them. And we needed to figure out who had vulnerability and how to go after them. And we made a choice in our industry to do no NLRB elections, to use strikes, to use pension power, to use public support, to build the kind of power that could organize lots of workers. And we said that our goal had to be to campaign on the appropriate level, which was to organize entire markets to take wages out of competition. We did lots of strikes. We did sit-ins. For those who may remember, we shut down all of Washington, D.C. by parking buses on the 14th Street Bridge, which it turns out Congress doesn't meet when you do that because they can't get in. John Sweeney, I remember him calling me. I won't quote him directly because I think we forgot to say we were going to do this. And when they started to get calls from Congress people saying, we can't get to work because the goddamn janitors are blocking the bridge. But anyway, that we learned something about the transformative power of militancy, how workers and the public respond. And people said, well, how could you get away with being so disruptive? And we could get away with it because we'd built a campaign that was about the poorest people fighting the richest people. And we're able to win incredible public support, even when we did what some people thought was outrageous. Other key parts of it is going really, really deep with members, because a core part of Justice for Janitors strategy was getting union members in unionized cities to honor picket lines from other cities. We spread strikes all over the country. And we also went global and did janitor campaigns all over the world, because most of the major cleaning contractors and building owners were global. And so one way to think about it is we took all the things that were being tried, policy organizing, bargaining to organize, all these different things, and did them all at once in cities all over the country. And in the end, we organized a couple 100,000 janitors, but I think more than the numbers, we built a movement of the poorest workers and proved that the very people who everybody said couldn't be organized, could be organized. And I'll never forget going to two things in this. One, you may know the story of the Century City police riot in 1990 when we were attacked and 60 people were beaten, written about it. And I remember going to meetings, and it turns out about 20,000 people must have been there. There were only 1,000, because everywhere I'd go, somebody'd saying, I was in Century City. And I said, really? But more, it really was sort of amazing how much that became a touch point. But anyway, I think on Justice for Janitors, we were grappling with neoliberalism. We didn't think about it that way. We were dealing with, because what we found out is happening is that looking at what was happening to the poorest workers was a window into what was going to happen to all workers. That it was first janitors who were part-time and subcontract and lost their insurance, but that spread throughout the whole economy. So I think there's a lot of lessons in Justice for Janitors. And one thing I want to point out, the other really critical lesson, and this will be controversial and some people won't like that I'm going to say it, but Paula always encourages me to controversial, is that our very success crippled the campaign. Because as we grew, as we proved we could win, many people then wanted to have good relations with the employers. And many people didn't want to risk what had been won. And we had a strategy that was based on using our power in unionized cities to organize all over the country. And there was a point where some folks sort of said, and I think this is symbolic of the whole labor movement, we're doing pretty good. Why are we going to keep doing these strikes? Why are we going to do these injunctions? Why are we going to do all this stuff if we're doing okay in our city? So I think there's some important lessons around Justice for Janitors and that. And then the other thing, have people heard of union cities? Yes, no? So this was led by Marilyn Snyderman. I should be honest, I'm not pitching her because she's a good person. She's my wife. No, she's also a good person. And in union cities, when she was at field mobilization during that period Paula talked about at the AFL, it was this basic idea that we need a geographic focus, that it's central labor councils, it's where workers live, that we can start to build a movement. And so it was everything from mapping power in the communities. It was looking at how we dealt with community groups in different kind of relationships that weren't transactional. Again, it was, but one of the key ideas behind union cities was, how do we marry sectoral organizing, which is organizing a whole industry, with geographic organizing? That sectoral organizing doesn't necessarily build the same kind of momentum because it's spread around the country, and it's geographic organizing that lets us go really, really deep with members and all of that. And so a big part of union cities was creating an environment in cities around the country to support organizing. And one of the real dilemmas was, guess what wasn't going on as union cities was being built all over the country? There wasn't much organizing going on. And so that you had this tremendous contradiction, which is you're building this whole capacity to support organizing, but not only were most unions not doing significant organizing, they were terrified of people organizing independently within local cities versus being controlled by national campaigns. So union cities, again, did incredible work, but in the end, reading my notes, in the end was hobbled by a labor movement that really wasn't committed to organizing. Everybody, how much time do I have here? I know I'm rambling a little bit. What do I got? Yeah, 30 minutes. What? 5. Okay, good. So as we think about this, if we say we've done good stuff, we're potentially in a moment, then I want to think a little bit about what are our goals now? Because, some people say, well, the goal should be a certain number of members, right? Other people say it should be to build power. There's all sorts of issues of what the goals are. But I think I want to go back to where I started, that if our goal is just to get more members, we will neither get more members, nor will we have the kind of world we want. And I really want to stress that, because my entire life in the labor movement, I've heard people say, well, all workers care about is making a little bit more money and blah, 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 blah. It's both insulting to workers to say that. It's not true, but it also destines us to failure. So if we're thinking about where we are now and the collapse of neoliberalism, to me, the big difference between now and what we tried in the past is that potentially we have the wind behind our back, or whatever metaphor you want. We're not swimming upstream. How should I beat this to death? Phil, do you have another good one? The wind isn't blowing in our face. So that if you say there's a lot of stuff we've learned, a lot of it's relevant, something's going on in the world, then the question is, what do we do now if we really believe the wind is at our back? And if we also believe the stakes are so much higher than at any other time in our lives? That the stakes here are not whether we put some numbers on the board. The stakes aren't, can we beat an employer? The stakes are we going to have democracy? Are we going to have freedom? Are we going to, all of that? And so what that leads me to think about is that really starting, I would say, with Occupy in a way, that we have a generation that has learned that capitalism doesn't work. And we now have another generation of people that are experiencing, as you talked about, as expendable workers, that it doesn't work. So the challenge for us is not just to organize, but to have a vision of what we're trying to create and a way to engage people in that in the broadest way. And one of the ways that I think we can potentially do this, who's heard of bargaining for common good here? Okay, for those who haven't, it's very hard to find out about it. You go to bargainingforcommongood.org. And then the other thing is Nonprofit Quarterly is running for the past month, every week, different articles about different pieces. But the idea behind bargaining for common good is really in some ways to combine the notion of union cities and justice for janitors, in the sense that we're trying to take a bunch of things and put them together. And the basic idea behind bargaining for common good is how do labor, community, racial justice, and other groups work together to expand bargaining and organizing beyond just wages and benefits. That how do we speak to the whole lives of workers and what we're what we're fighting for, and then how do we go after the appropriate level of power to win that? So an example is the Chicago teachers striking. One of their issues was homeless students. Now, why would the teachers strike over homeless students? Because 40,000 kids in the Chicago school system have different homes at night. They don't come to school saying my dog ate my paper, my homework, saying I got locked out of the house. I was sleeping on a friend's couch. And the city went berserk. They're saying you're striking over what the city is going to do about homelessness. It's utopian. And thank God the local says, yes, it's utopian. We think there shouldn't be homeless students. That's one example how bargaining for common good didn't. And one of the key things about that strike is they took on neoliberalism. They said in Chicago, the school systems broke on purpose, meaning you cut taxes, you give money to the rich, and then you say there's no money and we all should fight ourselves over the crumbs. And the Chicago teachers said, we're not going to do that. We're not going to compete with other unions or public services. It's broke on purpose. We have to do something different. In Minneapolis 2 years ago, the janitors local had one of the first climate strikes. Janitors who were mainly immigrants, often from countries where climate crisis forced them to leave because they couldn't farm anymore, went on strike over, they had a whole series of demands about emissions in buildings. I don't have time to go through it all. And they brought climate groups to the bargaining table with them. And when they went out, 1,000 student strikers came also. So where they took the bargaining moment and made it not just about getting a raise, but they made it about how are we going to stop the world from killing itself? So in bargaining for common good, what we're trying to do is we have a network of unions and community groups, and we're trying to figure out how folks can work together, not just on the organizing issue, but also on housing, on all the related issues. And so we're building a movement about how we both take on the issues of the time, but also how we take on the power that we need to take on. And that's sort of, because I'm running out of time here, where I'd end. which is I think sometimes on our side, we forget about this question of power and what does it take to win? And what it's going to take to win is that we have to be willing to break the law. We will not win if we obey the law, because all the laws, I think the teachers in Massachusetts just are getting fined $250,000 for a so-called illegal strike. That we need to be ready to do a whole series of things if we're going to seize this moment right now. And I think if you look at bargaining for common good, it's an example of how community labor and racial justice groups are saying, we can do this all at once, not transactionally together, as part of building a grander, bigger movement that isn't narrow, but is broad. So I guess I'd end I started off by saying I have some trepidation because I'm a terrible predictor of the future, because it turns out I've been wrong for 40 years. But I really think this is it, folks. Maybe it's because I'm a little older than some folks here, but we've got conditions that are ripe for organizing. There's angry workers. There's a collapse of neoliberalism. And if we don't seize this moment, if we don't do something different, if we don't build a grand, broad movement, let's all remember that unions grow as part of broader social movements. They don't grow in a vacuum. If we don't do this, it's not just shaming us, but it's our kids and grandkids that are going to bear the consequence of our failure. So I'd end by saying I'm both optimistic and fucking terrified at the same time. And it's why I normally give a pounding speech, do this, do that. I don't know exactly what we should do, but I do know that this is our last best chance at this time for the existing labor movement to rise to it. I think if this labor movement dies, something new will be born. But we've got billions of dollars in resources. We've got enormous power. And let's all commit ourselves to building the kind of movement that's about challenging the world that we're living in and fighting for the world we want to create, versus accepting the sort of Hunger Games logic of we should just get a little bit and be satisfied with that. So I'll end with, it's great to see everybody. I hope we come back in a couple of years and say the 25th anniversary was the birth of a new world, not just the birth of a new thing. And thank you all very much.
Not the first time, so. So first of all, I'm very honored to be here to speak at this event, the anniversary of the journal. And I was asked recently, actually, by some folks at MIT, why do I write for the journal, for the New Labor Forum? And I said, it's because I want to write for a journal that more than 10 people read who sit in academia and have no connection to practice. But I also want to write for a journal that has really high editorial standards and really critical thinkers and reviewers, and that's this journal. And so, you know, I made people read the journal. And so it's an honor for me to be here. It's also, I'm always happy to come to CUNY. I'm a two-time CUNY grad. And, you know, I'm very proud of that. And I love the fact that SLU is at CUNY and it's, you know, embedded in the labor movement. And, you know, to me, it really represents the best of what CUNY is and can be. I'm going to try and stick with what Paul asked me to talk about, but I asked to come after Steve because actually I knew Steve would cover and say a lot of the things I'd want to say, which he did. Paul asked me to speak about both the labor movement and the black movements since the late 90s. I'm going to deal more with the black movements. But I will say, one of the highlights I remember from the Justice for Janitors movement, where I actually saw it closer in LA than anywhere else, working with the Labor Resource Center in LA and other leaders there, was the leadership strategy. Miguel Contreras, like one of the things I remember clearly was they said, you know, we have all these undocumented workers here, but a lot of them were organizers in their home countries, and they're very strategic. And even though they can't vote here and don't have rights here, they sure as hell can organize here. So let's organize them to organize the others, including the Mexicans born in here who don't know politics or organize. And that was a brilliant strategy. There were a lot of brilliant strategies that went into that. The other thing I remember was it was part of the fight back against Prop 187, which was an attack on immigrants throughout the whole state of California. And I remember 2 million people marching through LA around this fighting back against 187. It was a mass, huge movement. And out of that came Pablo Alvarado and a lot of the day labor movements. There was just a huge movement that embraced the whole community. And I heard Steve say something earlier that labor grows in periods like that, when there are other things that are happening. So I saw that. I wanted to mention the Fight for 15, which I recall when folks were talking about, we're going to organize fast foods around $15 an hour. And I was like, great, $15 an hour is great in fast foods, but in the Black community, fast foods are killing us, literally. We have an epidemic of diabetes and hypertension, and fast foods is a driver of that. And if the union would expand it from just talking about $15 an hour to say, let's also change what they serve. Let's make the food healthier. I know for a fact I can get a lot of Black organizations to join in because they're really deep into that issue. And they wouldn't see the union as just being opportunistic. Like the union just wants more members. They're, they don't really care about us, blah, blah, blah. So I proposed that way back then. Guess what? Nope. Folks didn't want to take on the broader issue of health in the Black communities. They saw it as a distraction, but actually it's very central if you're actually caring about workers and their families and people's lives. Paula said, would you mention the immigrants tour that happened? And what I remember is this. Years ago, Kent Wong, who's the Labor Resource Center, UCLA, joined with Reverend Jim Lawson, who was actually the minister in Memphis, who invited Martin Luther King to come to Memphis to support the sanitation workers strike, which is where King was assassinated. Jim Lawson had long joined together labor struggles and civil rights. So Jim and Kent started teaching a class with students around undocumented students. And there was something called the undocumented underground, where they were like sending students from California up to Seattle where you could get a driver's license. And there was a whole thing worked out around that. The immigrant march was conceived of in those classes with young undocumented students. And they did a tour throughout the South, and they visited civil rights sites and met with a lot of civil rights leaders, including John Lewis and many others. And it really was transformative for them, but also transformative for the civil rights leaders themselves to meet these young students, organizers. And one of the things UCLA Labor Resource Center did was place students in the summers in labor unions and other advocacy organizations. And so far they've placed like 700, where they would gain experience, learning organizing. A lot of things came out of that, car wash organizing campaign in LA, other things. So these same students, they went to all these civil rights places. I mention it because if you go to the Montgomery Civil Rights Museum, which just opened a few years ago, Obama funded it, it's much better than the Washington, D.C. Museum on African American History. The Montgomery Museum talks about the history of Blacks organizing in the steel industry, about labor is a central theme through the whole thing. And then it's done chronologically through Black history. The last part of the museum is not about Black people. It's actually about Latino, undocumented workers and students organizing with civil rights leaders saying, this is our legacy. These are us now. People who are denied rights, who are exploited, at the workplace and in their lives who fight back. That's what our movement was about. These are the representatives of our movement now. If you go to the Memphis Civil Rights Museum, same thing. It ends up talking about undocumented workers and students and how that epitomizes what the civil rights struggle was about. So that was one of the things that came out of that march. I really want to focus on something that irritates me. And that is, I've read so many accounts of the 80s and 90s and saying what happened was the civil rights movement moved away from class issues and became an identity movement like the environmental movement, the women's movement, the gay and rights movement. These were all identity movements that ignored the plight of white male workers. And this in turn fed resentment on the part of white male workers against the Democratic Party and progressivism more generally. The irritation I have with these accounts is that I think they're wrong. For one thing, they tend to treat these other movements like the civil rights movement as a single thing with little depth of understanding. There's a left wing and a right wing in the civil rights movement, just like there's a left wing and a right wing in the labor movement. People don't usually put 1199 into building trades in the same category. But when it comes to the civil rights movement, it's like one thing, right? Like there's no differentiation. The Jesse Jackson campaigns during the 1980s were to the left of the civil rights movement, on the left side of the civil rights movement, not because Jesse started out that way. It was because he got pressured that way by the organizers in the base, and that was deliberate. You know, I was part of that. We organized hundreds of Black organizers in the South because we didn't like Jesse. But we said, he's attracting a lot of support in the community, so we got to support him and then move him to the left, and we did. And we did. In the '88 campaign, he made a big push for labor support, talked about labor issues all the time, trying to fuse labor and civil rights together. Not a lot of unions responded. Some did. Not a lot of unions responded. I was part of organizing in the South coming out of the Black student movement. I came right out of, something called the February 1st movement. We took up labor issues, tried to, and one of the first things that happened in textile was the former head of student government at Bennett College, is a Black women's college in North Carolina, was assassinated. She got elected president of a local trying to join Unite, HERE. I forget what, was it Unite then? I think it was Act Two. It was Act Two. She was assassinated along with 4 other people. I was 23 years old. I was asked to give the eulogy for the assassinated organizers. 4 of the 5 had recently been elected presidents of their locals. And it was the Ku Klux Klan and neo-Nazis who assassinated them, brought in there by textile mill owners who wanted to divide up a multiracial organizing campaign. So that's what they did. And so to me, the link between the Black struggle and the labor struggle was always the same thing. And it was very clarifying at that moment. And they'd always been linked for my parents and my grandparents as well. Some of those same organizers got together with a bunch of preachers, I recall. 40 of them went on the golf course on a nationally televised PGA tournament and disrupted it in support of striking workers at a Winston-Salem, I believe was a Kmart distribution center, shut the whole thing down. And then the ministers went, and I was part of this, they went to the AFL-CIO and said, we'd like to organize public sector workers in North Carolina. We've studied, there's 700 public sector workers, 450,000 of them are Black. we'd like to unionize them. We want your support, AFL-CIO, to unionize them. Guess what happened? They were told no. One of those ministers, Reverend Herbert Nelson, went on to organize a ministry of the homeless in Memphis, did that for 13 years, built a movement in the Presbyterian Church. He is now the first African-American head of the National Global Presbyterian Church in history. 2 minutes? Oh my God. So that guy was one of those ministers. Another one was Reverend Barber, who's now doing poor people's movements, but they were turned down. I wanted to give you more examples of the building trades turning down an offer from the mayor of Memphis to organize Memphis, to bring the building trades into Memphis, of the NAACP trying to go to the UAW to play a leading role in organizing a Nissan plant in Jackson, Mississippi, having a big struggle with that, and I could keep going. What I want to say in the couple minutes I have left is, it is true that some African Americans ignore the plight of white workers. It's kind of hard when the masses of white workers elected Donald Trump to convince some people, particularly young people, that those are our brothers and sisters and we gotta see through that and organize and unite them. Yes. However, I think the bigger problem has not been lack of African American interest in labor. And this is the main thing I want to get across. Slavery was thoroughly capitalistic. Slaves were not peasants. This wasn't feudalism. The Civil War was the most biggest labor struggle in American history. Black people did not work for 300 years without a paycheck and not realize we had a labor issue. This was debated and discussed. What Black people said is, even deeper than the machinations of capitalism, is actually lack of humanity. It's inhumanity that is even deeper, and we have to root that out. And that is how Black folks have thought about it. And so Black Lives Matter actually was a very good slogan that is really about that point of view. And that all of these movements are interconnected because we're really talking about our humanity as people. And I think I agree with Steve. Today is an amazing opportunity to organize. It's also like the beginning of the Weimar Republic. There's a danger of fascism. What really is going to determine our ability to build a big movement is whether or not we can actually broaden our conception of economic organizing to include the full humanness and humanity and the voices of all people. That is really the struggle. I do think with the Biden administration pushing through 3 bills, the infrastructure bill, Inflation Reduction Act, CHIPS and science, there actually are trillions of dollars on the table now that can be leveraged and refashioned to build a different kind of new industrialism, advanced manufacturing in America, a different kind of community wealth and empowerment building, a change who owns the internet. We can do a lot of these things right now if we have the right outlook. I've never seen in my lifetime a better time for organizing. But what I learned in North Carolina in the 1970s is that this may be a bloody struggle. This is not going to be an easy struggle. For 10 years, I've been working with the Colombian Black movement, which is also a labor movement. They won a national election. You know, a few weeks ago, the vice president is a Black woman who comes out of the movement. Her chief of staff was murdered 3 weeks ago. Yeah, I mean, that's just how it is there. Those pro-Trump forces in Colombia are the same people we're dealing with here, are the same people that are in Hungary, in Eastern Europe right now. It's really a global struggle now that we're engaged in, but we can win this.
Hi, everybody. That was a tough act to follow. I want to say first that I'm very honored to be part of the program of this event. I've been at it for more than 25 years, but I've been very happy to be part of the, thank you. Yeah, I'm not quite as tall as some of the others. To be associated with the journal. And as Paula mentioned, I've written several pieces for it. I wish I had time to share some anecdotes about that, but I know we're already behind schedule, so I'm going to cut to the chase. But I do want to add my voice to the many accolades for Paula's work and for that of the journal over all these years. My talk today, as there is a PowerPoint here, I guess I'm the token academic on the program, so that's how I do it. I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but it's there, and it might be helpful to have a look at it as I speak. As you can see from the title, my talk is going to be about what I see as a new political generation. Notice on this panel, we're all a little old. We're a different generation than the people who are making things happen today in the streets and in the labor movement. And it's their time. They've made unions cool again, as I like to say. That's something special because it hasn't been true for quite some time. And maybe it's good that many of them don't have yet to learn how tough it is to establish, lasting labor organization. Maybe if they already knew all that and all the struggles and that we've all been through, they wouldn't try because it is really hard. So that's what I'm going to talk about. Prediction, I've learned the hard way, like Steve has talked about, is a very hazardous business. I've mostly been wrong in my predictions, so I'm not going to make any, but I am going to say that there's reasons to be cautious about this moment. Oh, I have to turn it on, don't I? You did tell me that. On. Still not. What am I supposed to point to? Oh, there we go. Okay, so other people have talked about this, so I'm going to go through this first part really quickly. As you all know, there have been many signs of labor movement revival in the last year and a half or so. Striketober, Paula already mentioned that the Amazon Staten Island surprise victory. I think I thought I was hallucinating when I first saw it. I don't know what other people thought, but no, Amazon certainly didn't expect it, nor did anybody else. The Starbucks campaign that you all know about, which has over 200 shops that they've unionized already and more coming. Other union wins in retail, Apple, REI, Trader Joe's, and more. So what I want to focus on is that all these efforts, though not Striketober, and maybe there'll be time to talk about this later, but all the others were led by young, college-educated, and I'll talk more about why that matters, workers. And in most cases, not at Amazon, but at almost all the others, that was also the dominant demographic among the workers themselves. Some of you might have seen this piece in the New York Times a while ago that emphasized this point. And if you look at polling data, which, is constantly mentioned in the news coverage about the labor movement, oh, there's suddenly all this public approval of unions. Notice there's an age gradient there too, and it's young people who are the most enthusiastic and positive about unions, and college graduates in particular. Well, so this is kind of a historic break. As you may know, young workers are the least likely to be unionized even today, and that's been true for quite a long time. So what's going on here? I'll try to answer that what's going on here in a minute, but let me first point out what has already been mentioned, that the pandemic has been a spur to some of this activism too. It, as Paula already mentioned, raised awareness of so-called essential workers and all the injustices that they daily confront. It also raised the awareness of workers themselves. Oh, there we go. Making them more receptive perhaps to these efforts to organize. And the labor shortage, as was already mentioned too, neutralize the fear that often is associated with these organizing efforts. You know, if you get fired from Starbucks right now, you can get another job just as bad around the corner, and everybody knows that. That may not last, by the way, but that's the case right now. Still. This is a chart of NLRB elections. I think those of you who didn't know before, the younger folks in here now know what those are. So I don't have to explain it. That was probably not true 3 years ago, but it is now. Notice that there's a big dip during the pandemic, and then we see the uptick. Oh, it's not there. My goodness, what happened? There we go. Notice the dip during the pandemic, quite dramatic, and then a recovery from that and quite an uptick lately. But you don't have to go back very many years to see a lot more of those elections. So just keep that in mind. This is definitely a moment, but it's not maybe quite as huge as we might suspect from all the media coverage. But still, and I think that's partly, I'll just say, because of the iconic character of some of the companies that have been successfully organized. You know, if it's Joe Schmo's shop down the street, nobody's really interested in the media. And well, I'll give some other examples of that later. When it's Amazon, the world is riveted. So the media has amplified this stuff beyond perhaps its numerical scale. Still, something important is happening here. What on earth? Oh my God. This is bad news. Why? They didn't want me to do it, and maybe I should stop because this is not working very well. It just has a mind of its own. All right, I'm just going to talk in that case. Something here, 5 minutes, is that really true? I've been talking for 10 minutes, no way. Sorry, you're not keeping track, I am. Okay, so something is happening here among young college. Can we just turn this thing off? Because I think it's now going to distract people since it's not at all coordinated with my remarks. Is there a way to just turn off the PowerPoint? Okay, thank you. Well, maybe not in time. Okay. So in a nutshell, the way I look at this is the following, that this new generation, and Steve kind of alluded to this before, that's taken on all this work, dates from basically 2008. I see it as a generation that was formed by the events following 2008, the Great Recession, Obama, and everything that's followed. Disappointment with Obama and the economic crisis that coincided with his initial ascent, created a new political generation of first millennials, later joined by Gen Zers. I don't love that language, but that's what people say. Many with huge student debt. And the leadership of the movements that ensued, including Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, and now the union organizing that we're seeing, was the result. And this is a generation that was, because especially those who were college educated, had certain expectations of the labor market and of the society that were totally disappointed, that there was a huge gap between their expectations and the reality they faced. I think you can see that really clearly in a college educated worker who lands at Starbucks, like that Rhodes Scholar that the New York Times profiled recently. That's probably not the career she was dreaming of when she started out. A couple of us here at SLU did a study of Occupy Wall Street when it landed on our doorstep in 2011. And we did a survey where we documented that the leading demographic there was indeed college educated young people. And that's how I first kind of fastened on this. Later on, we learned that the same demographic led Black Lives Matter. I've written about this and I don't have my slides, but long story how we figured this out, but the leadership were overwhelmingly college educated. They were also disproportionately female and queer, by the way, but that's another story. This is a generation that, especially again, the college educated segment of it, for whom intersectionality is taken for granted as a informing their worldview. That was not the case in earlier generations. I started out as a socialist feminist, remember that quaint term? So maybe for us it was, but for many people, these were seen as like separate worlds, although Phil talked about the same thing in relation to race. So, but we didn't have the language for it. I don't think, whereas for this political generation, this is just how it is. Like it's understood, even if it's not stated explicitly, that all of these struggles are connected. That's very important. Now, this is also the group that led the Sanders electoral campaigns. And this is the group, again, I had a slide about this, but whatever. If you look at those polling data on attitudes about capitalism and socialism, again, it's the college-educated young people who think socialism sounds great, capitalism, not so great. Capitalism sucks, as my son once put it. He's that generation. And he was 5 when he said that, but anyway. Well, he's my kid. What can I say? He got it early. Okay, so union activism now has kind of entered the mix. First it was Occupy, Black Lives Matter, some other stuff too, but and it didn't start in the last year. This generation's union activism actually goes back earlier. Again, it wasn't at Amazon or Starbucks, so nobody was really paying attention. But in higher education, the industry I work in, as they call it an industry now, adjuncts and graduate student workers have been at it for quite some time, certainly since 2008, actually even before, but it accelerates after the crash of 2008. Journalists have been doing this. Notice these are those two examples. They're highly educated, super exploited, right? Again, huge gap between expectations and reality. The Red for Ed, Red State teacher strikes of 2018 were also led by younger teachers. They were organized on Facebook, actually, which tells you something already. There's more. It's the staffs of nonprofits, museum workers. A lot of this, most of it actually preceded the pandemic, preceded the Amazon, Starbucks, et cetera, stuff that we're seeing now. So it's been happening for a while. I was going to show you a slide showing the Teen Vogue promotion of union organizing, which is something I guess I never imagined when I was younger, but. All right, college education matters here for a couple reasons. I already mentioned the gap between expectations and what you actually find. I think because college educated workers have developed pretty good critical thinking skills, they are much less susceptible to all the union busting BS that one is confronted with whenever one attempts to organize a union, especially in the private sector. I think this group sees through that now. And perhaps most important of all, their relatively privileged class position gives them some confidence in their own efficacy, which really matters when you're trying to organize. However, mindful of the clock, I'm gonna just point out that there are many obstacles in the path of these efforts. I'm sure most people in this room know this, but employer opposition has not gone away. Starbucks is firing people when they organize. Nothing new there. Employers have been doing this for a long time when they're facing unionization efforts, but it's still happening. In recent years, only about half of NLRB elections that unions win ever get to a first contract. And we'll see what happens with these recent ones. It's not at all clear that that will happen. Now, as Steve pointed out, that's not the be all and end all. I mean, but it does matter. This is not easy to really establish a union that's actually there. You can, anyway. And in a labor force of over 160 million workers, which is what we have in this country, even the 8,325 at Staten Island Amazon is kind of a drop in the bucket. So we need to not exaggerate what's going on. So far, the number of newly organized workers as a result of all the efforts we've been all celebrating, and I am too, reading about and seeing on TV, is much too modest to really move the needle on union density. It has not budged. 6% of the private sector. Now, historically, we know that labor upsurges don't come one Starbucks at a time or even one Amazon warehouse at a time. Though so far we just have the one. They come in huge waves. Think about what you know about labor history, the 1930s being the most dramatic example. So it's definitely possible that this is the beginning of something like that. And I certainly hope it is. But it could also be a blip. It could be a moment rather than a new labor movement. And of course, I know everyone in this room hopes it's the former, but again, having been burned on the prediction front so many times, I'm not confident that that's the case. Either way, though, we do know that unions are cool again for this new generation. And that's not going to change. Even if these efforts are smashed, which is definitely a possibility, I don't think this generation is going away. They're going to outlive us. And I don't think they're going to abandon their hopes for a better society and a better world and a labor movement that actually has some heft to it. So that's the hopeful part for me, is the young people. So I'll just stop there, and sorry for the technological failure. Thanks.
Thank you so much, all three of you. Before we start the next panel, I want to give the audience an opportunity. I think maybe two questions, one from this side, one from this. And I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that we've got these, but I also wonder, Michael, are we okay getting a mic to each side of the room? And we'll take one person maybe on each side. So any questions, issues, concerns that anybody wants to raise with everyone or anyone on the panel? Let's take Arthur.
I appreciate this talk because it brings back a lot of memories for me too. One of the key things that I'd like to talk about is the neoliberalism and the financialization of our economy has done so much in terms of concentrating media and what we see, financializing education and healthcare, raising the costs of those key industries in terms of the economic well-being of people, and are organizing around how you change that as the key element to make a difference in going back to what I had the benefit of in the 60s, which was the New Deal era. That wasn't available to everyone because obviously there was great discrimination. But as the son of immigrants, I had the opportunity to go to a free city university and the opportunity to buy a house when I was at a civil service job in my 20s, something that the next generation has not been able to do. And those are key parts of what I think we need to be discussing in terms of addressing those basic social movement issues on how you change the economic system to meet our social needs.
I'll just say a few words. I read recently that 65% of all private equity capital in the entire world are US worker pensions, 65%. And Steve mentioned earlier that labor really doesn't control its own money. And it's ERISA, but even bigger than ERISA is the lack of sort of capacity and leadership on the part of labor to control their own money. And this is true of NICERS. This is true of many of the Taft-Hartley funds. I've sat in those pension board meetings, et cetera, and there's no institutional capacity for that. Business schools cater to business. We don't have anything like that that helps labor leaders manage huge sums of money. And you do need institutions, and you need an institutional approach to that, which we haven't built. And, you know, Stuyvesant Town was financed by Tishman Speyer, who put up 29 million of their own money and got 5.2 billion from NICERS, the Ontario Retirement Fund, CalPERS, and the Sovereign Fund of Singapore. And then they evicted workers from Stuyvesant Town. So, I mean, it happens all the time. The second point I say around that is that in Europe, the green movement 40 years ago started their own banks. And now those banks are sizable and they finance all kinds of progressive things. And our workers' money is what props up these banks. And we allow the Fed to give them interest, it's low interest money, and then the banks decide who gets financing, who doesn't. And that affects small businesses, it affects everything. And we haven't challenged those rules at the Fed level, but we could. And I just think a lot of it, in my opinion, is myopic kind of concept of what it means to organize around the economy. It's more than just unions and having more people in unions, that's important, but that's just the beginning.
That's fine.
Okay, we're gonna take one question from our Zoom audience.
Oh, great.
Jacob asks, how can the history of structural exclusion and uneven relations for food workers and other excluded workers, including agricultural, domestic, tipped, undocumented, off the books, et cetera, how can that help us understand where and why new worker-led strategies are being advanced in the food system today, especially in food retail, logistics, and service?
Even we're all looking at you.
You're looking at me, there's like 1 minute and that's a 2-minute question just to read it. I guess I'll make something up just because you looked at me, which is in a way, it's a little bit like the story of Justice for Janitors, which is we have a window into what capitalism wants to do by looking at the most exploited people without repeating the list of what you said, what the reader said. So to me, it's at the margins of capitalism where we both see what's in store for us and then we develop how we strategize and take it on. And so I think that's why a lot of what Phil talks, some of the most exciting work over the years, pre the college educated, was among those kinds of workers who were living the worst parts of the system. And that's also where we've been able to build sometimes the greatest support for militant action, because the general public gets it more when it's really low paid, exploited, off the books people protesting. And, and we haven't even been through the whole list of the drywall strike and all the other list of things that fit into that. So that's the best I can do on that question. I don't know if that got to the point, but what the hell?
You did get there.
Okay. I needed somebody from academia to tell me that as a non-academic.
I don't know if that's me.
I know.
Let's take one from this side of the room and then we'll go on to the next panel. Is there a question over here?
Nelson Lichtenstein. One thing that wasn't mentioned, although for good reason has a bad reputation, is the change in managerial attitudes toward unions. And this has a bad recent legacy because, lots of discussions of participation and win-win, and that's or just, some let's get our hedge fund together, and, it has a bad reputation. But I think, in fact, if you look back far enough, the big obstacle, the reason, as Ruth pointed out, this all delay and all these obstacles is because managers like Howard Schultz feel completely self-confident in what they're doing, right? And so, how do you begin to change that? The same with Bezos and everyone else. Well, okay, one way is the revolutions in the prospect, and so unions are the lesser evil. That's one thing, and that happened after World War I and times like that. Or you get a situation, and here the best analogy is the civil rights movement, where it becomes so pervasive that rank discrimination of a certain sort is just illicit, bad for business, that companies just don't do that anymore. They do, they're more subtle about it, but they don't do that. And so then you have companies now touting how much they're in favor of Black Lives Matter or things of that sort. So what would it take really to change managerial attitudes, to change, to think that unionism is either lesser evil or you have to do it? Well, one thing that's happening, and I think, is the revival of antitrust. And now this is just beginning as an idea, but we have, people in the Biden administration, the courts, of course, will still be there, but are thinking, well, the original antitrust in the 1890s was not just because prices were too high, but because these were, gigantic institutions oppressing workers. So one of the things I just read about is that, what's her name? This chief counsel of the NLRB, Bruzio, what's her first?
Abruzzo,
Yeah, Bruzzo, she's terrific. And Lena Khan, head of the FTC, they're meeting with each other. I mean, this is just the beginning. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but I mean, this is a way of really supercharging the labor law and making it what is Uber and Starbucks and Amazon afraid of, really? They're afraid that their business model is going to be, you know, subverted or broken up or whatnot, you know. And I think that has to be the kind of threat that both the union movement in cooperation with the government, you know, can make, and then they will see, oh yeah, maybe recognizing a union is the lesser evil to getting, you know, the whole thing broken up. And we have this odd situation today, and I don't count on it, where the extreme right and of course the left is really hostile to tech, you know. I mean, you know, and I don't want to go on about that because the right I don't trust, but nevertheless, there was a love feast between, what's that guy, Hawley, from but he's from Missouri. I mean, you know, the right, extreme right winger, and Lena Khan when she appeared at, you know, and you know what. So anyway, that's something that I think it's a long distance project, but I think it is something to be on our radar.
It's a great point. I just want to make one other comment that's related, which is that the consumer side of all this has yet to be leveraged. Companies like Starbucks and Amazon and Apple and all the others that we've been reading about where workers are trying to organize really do depend on the goodwill of consumers who now are much more sympathetic to unions than they used to be, right? And who they're worried about their corporate image and all that. So that's another lesser evil sort of scenario one could imagine. And I would love to see those campaigns take on the consumer piece a little more extensively than they have. So
I guess my biggest fear in a way is that what you describe will happen, meaning I think that monopoly is bad. And Amazon is not just about exploiting workers, about everything we know, surveillance society. So my biggest fear is that Amazon will come and say, we'll give you a couple warehouses, we won't fight the union if you don't break us up. And I think this is actually going to be in a really critical time for the labor movement, is that if that comes, to say no. That the goal here is not, can we get some Amazon warehouses union while they simultaneously have a grip on the economy and on the politics of this country. So I think we should I think anti-monopoly, I think all of that's incredibly important, but I wouldn't support it as an exchange because they're just going to, because partly the exchange made with capital before what gave them time to regroup and come after us. It's temporary. And so I'm not being so rigid that we shouldn't say we don't organize workers, but I would caution against making deals with the folks who want to destroy us, who are just going to give us a little bit of room before they come at us again.
Two quick things on that. One, 97% of Facebook and Twitter's and a lot of these other platforms' profits come from selling people's data that they do, you know, without people even realizing it. And that is a huge potential for consumer organizing and anti-monopoly organizing. I don't think it has to be in a quote unquote union in which you have to have a job and be a member. And we need to think about other kinds of parallel kinds of organizations to build up fitted to this economy. Secondly, Verizon and other descendants of Ma Bell in New York have, based on a 1911 franchise agreement for telephone wire, get the use of city facilities for free, and it's a monopoly. And they charge $54 on average for internet service, where it costs about $10, and the rest they just grab. There's legislation proposed right now at the state Senate to just say telephone wire is not an internet wire, which will completely break up that monopoly, create opportunities for whole new, including community-owned, worker-owned internet to blossom. The labor movement, if they support this, it will pass at the state legislature, but then it'd be on us to figure out what the new infrastructure looks like, and we'll have to run it. In my experience with labor leaders talking about this, they are scared to take that step. They say, we'd rather just bargain with a big company and what we know how to do and get a few more dollars an hour, but running an industry, that's just not something we want to do. I think that's a question we have to address ourselves in terms of tech.
I want to thank Phil, Stephen, and Ruth. And Samir, I'll introduce you as you come up, Samir, and the second panel. Maybe everybody wants to take a stretch for a minute. So we have Samir, Likia, are you all here? Maritza, okay, and Andrew. I'm going to introduce Samir just to keep the show on the road. Samir Santi is Assistant Professor of Urban Studies at the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies. And he is the Books and Arts Editor for New Labor Forum. It's been very lucky for me. He also is a host of New Labor Forum's podcast, Reinventing Solidarity, that I want to recommend to everybody, that you go and you check out the podcast. Samir is also completing his first book, The Price of Prosperity, Inflation, and the Limits of the New Deal Order. Prior to Samir's academic career, he served as special advisor on the presidential campaign of Bernie Sanders. And prior to that, he worked as a political organizer for the Pennsylvania Association of Staff Nurses and Allied Professionals, and a researcher for Unite Here. So thank you so much, Samir. I turn it over to you.
Hey, thank you so much. Thanks, thanks, Paula. It is really a tremendous honor to be asked to speak at the 25th anniversary event for this journal that I have read for my entire adult life. Actually, the first, and it's cool to be doing it with this group. The first time I wrote for New Labor Forum was a long time ago, and it was in a counterpoint with Andrew Ross, who's up here with me. And he was among the most gracious participants when I was, I don't know, young and didn't know anything, and he made me feel like I did know something, and it was quite a boost of confidence. So in any case, I've had the privilege of doing a lot with this journal over the years. I credit it with helping to bring me to SLU, which is, as many of my colleagues would say, the greatest job in the world teaching at an institution like this. And so I'm just so grateful, and Paula and Steve Frazier, both who really, encouraged me to get involved along, several years ago. It's made a huge difference for me. So thanks, Paula. I can't believe it's going to be, it's going to be very different without you. It's hard to imagine what that will be like, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Meantime, I am really, really excited to do this panel with four terrific co-panelists. Paul asked me to just kind of set the stage a little bit. This last panel, we were looking back at the last 40 or so years of where the labor movement's been. And this one, we're gonna predict the next 40 years. Maybe. So before we get that, I just set the stage a little bit. There's a lot that's been said. A lot of what I would have said in terms of framing is been covered by some of my predecessors. I mean, Stephen Lerner and Phil Thompson, also huge, legendary inspirations for me, and Ruth Milkman, a colleague. So they've all covered stuff that I would have said. I guess, what I'll say, of course, is this is an exciting time, and it's also a really scary time. It's kind of like the Dickensian moment, right? The best of times and the worst of times for the labor movement. And the specter of fascism is no doubt the thing, right? When we're talking about what's so terrifying about it. But I want to kind of pick up where that last panel was closing on the I guess the economic conjuncture that we're at in terms of, what that means as far as the challenges that we face goes. So, I think for those of us who, broadly identify with a working class political and economic vision, oddly enough, I think what just happened to Liz Truss in the UK is quite instructive. If they'll do that to a Tory, just, imagine what they will do to us. if and when we have power. It's all I've long held, you know, I mean, and as Paula noted, I worked on the Sanders campaign before I came to SLU. It always seemed to me that everyone, including much of the Democratic Party, was far more concerned about a Bernie Sanders presidency than a Donald Trump presidency, and not simply because of who Bernie Sanders is, but because of what he represented and what a left government would mean in global capitalism today. So, you know, we're living, you know, one thing that hasn't yet come up is, and I'm writing a book about this, so it's on my mind constantly, is this inflationary context in which we're living. Now, we have no idea where this is going to go, right? I mean, you know, this fluctuates month by month. It might be subsided by a year from now. It might be worse a year from now. We really don't know. What we do know are two things. One, it's already affected this administration, right, in pretty profound ways. We'll see how profound in a few weeks, but in fairly profound ways. And it's changed the course of what this administration expected they were going to be able to do. That's the immediate sense in which the conjuncture, the inflationary conjuncture, let's say, has set the stage for working class politics right now. But in a bigger sense, I think there's something even larger that we need to reckon with. And it's a reminder of what, you know, many commentators in the mid 20th century meant when they said, and this is a phrase that had some currency at the time, that inflation was the permanent dilemma of social democracy. It's permanent dilemma of social democracy. It's this contradiction that the labor movement and those of us committed to broader working class governance have to confront. So, all right, what do we mean by that? Let's just focus on this right now. In the absence of any kind of alternative, right, in the absence of an alternative economic policy, we are going to look at more and more austerity from the central banks and from fiscal authorities around the world, retrenchment, right? And the purpose of this is to drive us into depression, recession, something bad. Given the political forces swirling around us, what we're staring at economically is terrifying, right? I think we need to just be very clear. And we don't have a lot of power to mobilize against that right now, right? We're looking at a intentionally contractionary economic policy around the world in the face of right-wing forces that are unlike any of us have ever seen. And maybe some of our elders in this room when they were babies saw, right? But other than that, we haven't seen anything like this in a long time. And we're staring at an intentional effort by central bankers and public authorities all over the world to contract the global economy, to drive us into recession. To deal with this problem that, and this is a second point, probably can't be dealt with through this kind of policy, right? We're dealing with an inflation that is coming from supply side sources resulting from a pandemic in the first place, maybe to some degree, given momentum through other policies, demand and so on, whatever you want to blame Biden stimulus, there's probably a little bit of that one could do, but largely in the first place from supply side sources, the pandemic being the opening one. Well, what's the other big potential supply side source of inflationary pressure in the world going forward? A climate crisis, right? In a world of unprecedented storms, unpredictable everything, and reliance on fossil fuels, we're staring at structural inflationary pressure. Now, this isn't to say I'm not predicting that we're going to have inflation every single year for the next 25 years, but there is something structural that we're confronting that is not going away as long as we've got this crisis. And who knows, if we have another pandemic, we got a whole nother sort of, source of pressure. So we've got structural supply side, which is the economist's way of saying just like baked into the way we live. A fossil economy, a society that is prone to disruption, that's inflationary. And the only solution that we have is contractionary, inviting depressions, right? Raising interest rates, cutting budgets, implementing austerity. If the Republicans win in a couple of weeks, get ready for a prolonged period of budgetary warfare at the federal level. And in New York City, I think we can expect, especially if things go the way that they're going, budgetary warfare here as well, and at the state level, right? So we are staring at a lot of tough structural problems. Now, what is the way that we deal with this? How would we rather deal with what we're facing with? We obviously don't want ruthless bludgeons from central bankers and public authorities around the world. What do we want? Well, the only way you deal with this in the long term is through getting at the root of the problem, which is addressing what economists would say, productive capacity deficiencies of our economy, or what we might say, getting off fossil fuels, investing robustly in the things that we need, so the shortages that we all face in housing and energy and all kinds of things are alleviated, right? That is a major public investment program. That's not going to come on its own from the private sector as much as we might try to incentivize it. Now, how do we do that? Well, it takes purposeful public action. That, we also have to admit, may be inflationary. The government spending a lot of money to build housing, the government spending a lot of money to build green infrastructure, the government spending a lot of money to get us off fossil fuels might create inflationary pressure. So we got to figure out another way to deal with this problem. And what's another way to deal with this problem? Well, it used to be called planning, right? In the mid 20th century and the early 20th century, it used to be called planning. What does that mean? It means deeply intervening into the functioning of the economy, controlling prices, controlling capital movements, controlling sometimes what we can buy through rationing, offering subsidies when needed, a whole host of other things. Ultimately, what this amounts to is disciplining capital, right? Disciplining capital. And fundamentally, back to an earlier point from the comment in the end of that last panel, controlling what the financial sector can do, taking over the financial sector, taking it out of private hands and treating it like a public utility, which it is, right? That's what we need to do. Now, that is a big, tall order, right? That's a huge order. Probably don't have the power to do that tomorrow. May not have the power to do that between 2023 and 2024. But how do we get to the point where we can do that? Well, and as Arthur very graciously, mentioned a part of what I've written recently, but it seems to me, as always, this takes us back to where we started, which is through an organized working class that can actually wield influence at the highest levels of public policy, right? And that doesn't happen without an institutional labor movement. It never has happened without an institutional labor movement. There's no reason to believe it can happen without an institutional labor movement. And so the question is, how do we get there? Now, fortunately, we've got some experts with us who are building working class power. And we've seen a lot of that. And so I have no idea. I'm best at predicting the past, right? That's like usually what historians do well. But we've got a lot of people who are struggling with this some of them are right here with us. And obviously we know that's what's going on all over the world. We don't need to rehearse that right now. It has been as scary as it is, the most exciting time by far in my lifetime. I mean, to be in and around the labor movement. So with that, to think about, where we're going next 25 years, hopefully when we have our the 50th anniversary of New Labor Forum will be, I don't know, where will it be? I guess it'll be in the White House, probably. Yeah, right. Well, it'll be in the White House. So, all right. Yes, everyone is invited. So to help us navigate the road from, 43rd Street to 16th, Pennsylvania Avenue, we really terrific panelists. So I'm going to read their bios in order of when they're going to present, and then they'll come up one by one. So first is Maritza Silva Farrell, who is the executive director of the Alliance for a Greater New York, ALIGN, which is a coalition of labor and community organizations formed through a merger of New York Jobs with Justice and Urban Agenda. ALIGN's mission is to build movements for economic justice and to create jobs for a sustainable New York. In her long history of activism, Maritza Silva Farrell has worked with Long Island Jobs with Justice and USAS, United Students Against Sweatshop. She also serves on a number of boards, including the Edward J. Malloy Initiative for Construction Skills, Jobs with Justice, New York Communities Organizing Fund, and she is notably the recipient of the 2018 Rising Leader Award from our school, the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies. After Maritza will be co-presenters, Ligia Gualpa, who is the co-founder and executive director of the Workers' Justice Project, a New York City worker center with over 12,000 members, which helps low-wage immigrant workers in the gig economy organize for better pay and working conditions in such industries as construction and house cleaning. In March 2020, as the pandemic was spreading across New York, Gualpa founded Los Deliveristas Unidos to fight for rights and protections for New York City's 65,000 app-based food delivery workers. And her first article in New Labor Forum will appear in the spring 2023 issue. And joining Ligia up here will be Antonio Solis, who is one of the leaders of Los Deliveristas Unidos. And then finally will be Andrew Ross, who is professor of social and cultural analysis at NYU and an activist who supported the unionization of academic workers. He's a co-founder of the Gulf Labor Artists Coalition, Occupy Wall Street, and the Debt Collective. Ross is also the author or editor of 24 books, including several on labor and working class issues, including Stone Men, The Palestinians Who Built Israel, Fast Boat to China, Consequences of Free Trade, Lessons from Shanghai, and No Sweat, Fashion, Free Trade, and the Rights of Garment Workers. His most recent book is Sunbelt Blues, The Failure of American Housing, and he is also a regular contributor to New Labor Forum. Very excited for this discussion and look forward to a conversation afterwards.
Thank you so much. Wow. I am so grateful to be here this evening, this afternoon, still afternoon, yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me here today, and thank you for all those remarks. I was just like taking notes as you were talking, because a lot of what you talked about today is sort of what I've been thinking about for the past 15 years of my career. So let me share a little bit about who I am and who is Align. So my name is Maritza Silva Farrell. I am the executive director of Align New York. Align is an organization that has been building coalitions across the state to tackle specifically the issues that we're talking about today. How do we hold corporations accountable? How do we ensure that we build worker power? And more importantly, right now, to the point that you raised, is like, how do we tackle this existential crisis, which is climate change? And how do we make sure that those things are intersecting across the campaigns that we build? In order to be successful, the way we think about this work is that we have to connect all of the institutions that are working on these issues: environmental justice groups, grassroots organizations, labor unions, even businesses, and understanding how to work with all of those. So what I want to share today is our model, and how do we have been working with our national partners from Jobs with Justice, Power Switch Action, and ensuring that our model in New York State also is expanded everywhere else. Here in New York State, as we all know, is one of the states that have the highest density in the country for unionization, right? Is that right? Is that right? All the historians tell me I'm okay with that information. So that is true, right? The other issue is that New York is one of the most unequal, New York City particular cities in the country. Is that right? Yeah? Am I wrong? No? Okay. Well, but also is a very diverse city, right? In a very diverse state. We have people from all over the world. And myself, I am an immigrant as well. So I think we do have a lot to work with, but the thing that sometimes we don't think about when we work at the intersection of all these issues, specifically when we do worker power building, which is the main reason why we're here today, is what are the structural issues that we have to address? And when you talked about the structural issues and what is the root causes of the problems that we face, I was very excited that you brought that up, because if we don't get to that in different forms, we're not going to be able to build the worker power that we imagine. We're not going to be able to tackle the climate crisis. So what we have been doing is organizing strategic coalitions across the state that focuses on regulatory policy solutions on
that addresses climate change and also builds worker power. It's a very hard challenge because you have the labor unions who are established in New York State, and they're used to doing things the way they do. And you also have the organizations in the labor, in the grassroots movement who are upset with the labor movement, right? We talked about this earlier, right? Like, I really appreciate your comments, Phil, about like, they are transactional. They have historically been transactional. Many of the unions, we shouldn't say they because there are all types of unions, right? But traditionally, they have been seen as transactional. So our work is really to get to the core of those problems of how do we make all of these institutions to work together to get the solutions that we need. And in the midst of all this movement that's happening right now, I love what Ruth said, is it a moment or is this really a movement? We have to think about what is our short-term strategy, our long-term strategy within the context of the moment that we're in, right? There is a lot of great things to celebrate, but also there's things that we have to stop and think for a moment. There are 3 things that I want to share that I have been learning through the years of doing this work. Is that it's not by just building worker power, but we have to build long-lasting worker power. And that is something that is very different to what we are used to, right? Like, do we want to win the contract today? Or do we want to have a long-lasting plan? Speaking about planning. So that's one of the key pieces. Workers' issues, as mentioned earlier, are beyond wages and benefits. And I think that the current movement is highlighting that so much. One of the things that I've been seeing happening is talking about childcare. How can a worker go to work if they don't have childcare, right? And how that is part of the conversation. Health and safety. A worker needs to have health and safety in their workplace and also ensure that their communities are clean, that there is clean water, right? There is so many things that intersect, and that's what we're looking to do in this work. And in order for us to be successful, the way I personally think we have to think about is how do we build strong institutions? And that is not only to say that we're talking about unions, we're talking about all the institutions that are in a movement. This institution, labor unions, community groups, grassroots organizations, we have to actually build strong institutions. And the way we build strong institutions is when we have the deep commitment of the people who are affected by the issues, who are the ones who are leading in the fight, leading in the policy development, and being part of the solutions, because they are the ones who knows, they know always, they always know where the solutions are. So we cannot undercount that. And that's what we do at Align. We bring academics, we bring the workers, the communities that are affected, and bring the institutions that are able to put this work forward. Lastly, government. So it was talked about the importance of government in holding corporations accountable. When we talk about getting to the root causes, we also have to think about how do we peel away the power that these large corporations have been building. Amazon is a great example of that. Tech companies are a great example of that. Just take a look at Apple, right? You see all of the organizing taking place. It's nice to hear my echo. I can hear the accent now. Apple is organizing workers. In the tech industry, we see worker organizing taking place, right? Those industries before weren't organizing, right? So that is an important thing to keep in mind. And then the point of antitrust, I love that was brought up. It's so wonky. It's just like you have to talk about antitrust laws. It's the wonkiest thing ever. How do we actually make the antitrust attractive and understood to the day-to-day worker, to the day-to-day community, to the family member? Without antitrust, we cannot actually shift the economy and the power that we currently have. Right now, corporations have the ability legally to grow as much as they want. So we got to get to that root cause and demand that governments, specifically state governments, do something about it. That's something that we're trying to do here in New York State. And I'm going to make a plug here. New York State passed the antitrust law legislation this past Senate. It's passed session in the Senate. The Assembly fell short, so we didn't pass it. So next year, we're going to try it again. That is going to be an important way in which we can actually peel away some of the power that these corporations have and allow for workers to be able to organize. I want to address a point also that was raised earlier about excluded workers. I talked about the diversity that we have in our state. And I want to also emphasize that excluded workers weren't excluded just during the pandemic, because that is a misconception, right? Workers who were and have been excluded for many, many years, who are immigrants, Black, brown communities of color, have been excluded from our systems as a whole. However, many of them pay taxes, right? And for them to demand that they have some relief funds during the time of the height of the pandemic was just a little ask. In the moments where they were actually giving so much to us to be able to sustain in a moment of a pandemic, right? And this is a time when our systems are failing, because then we are not just giving back. We are just clapping outside in the streets and making ourselves feel good, right? So we have to challenge some of those assumptions that doing that kind of stuff and just say, hey, excluded workers, we gotta help you with this policy here or this thing over here. It's not a long-term solution. We got to integrate workers in those sectors as part of our economy and as part of our communities as a whole, not only when we need them. And that has been something that we've been discussing a lot. Lastly, let's recognize, and I always talked about this with folks because we have short-term memory. You agree with me? Do you agree with me? I mean, for the historians might agree with me, but yeah, we have short-term memory. The pandemic is still here, right? And workers are still exposed. Workers are still facing really bad working conditions. And yet, we're hearing all this amazing organizing with all these companies right now, and we're celebrating and saying, yes, this is great. We're doing great work. Let's keep doing it. But the reality is that workers in many sectors are still not able to even organize because these corporations are undermining their ability to just step up and speak for the issues. Why? Because they cannot be held accountable. Departments like the Department of Labor don't have enforcement mechanisms in many cases, or they do, but they don't have enough resources to enforce. And that is something that we have been seeing a lot, right? So if we have a government that needs to hold corporations accountable and support the worker organizing that we are all doing, then we need to make sure that the systems internally, agencies are able to function, to be able to govern with them. And lastly, when we began doing campaigns, particularly on climate, and I was just told that I have 5 minutes. I want to touch on this because this touches across the country, right? Like I've been hearing a lot of policies that are right now really modeling after the incredible policy that we passed here in New York State. Are you all familiar with the Climate Leadership Community Protection Act? Yes, no, maybe? Yes, I see the nods. Okay, yes, great. Well, this law is the most ambitious law in the country. It will get us to just be completely off fossil fuels by 2050, right? So to the point, how do we get to that root cause? We really need to ensure that there is enough resources from government as much as private sectors to ensure that that policy is implemented correctly so that these buildings and all the buildings across the state are energy efficient, so that we have solar panels, so that we have the infrastructure, so that we have more electric vehicles around the city. We have school buses and things of that nature, right? And those conversations aren't happening only on the policymakers or the folks who understand that. Those conversations are happening in communities where workers are also talking about what health and safety means to them. It's beyond a masking, right? We need to have ventilation in our places to be able to feel health and safety in our workplace. And all those kind of things are discussing. And I will say in moments of crisis is where we get to see the holes and the gaps of our systems. And we saw a lot of this during this pandemic. We continue to see some of that. And it is our role, regardless of how the future might come, to make sure that the future is better for our communities. And I will end with one more note. That will never happen if there is no enough engagement from all of the sectors. Every single person in this room has a role to play. Every single person. And if you don't engage, and if you're not part of the movement, not only in solidarity, but also in doing it and demanding that government is held accountable, demanding that corporations are accountable, then we're not going to be able to do it. We all have a role to play. And I really appreciate all of you for being here today. And thank you for inviting me.
So I'm not here alone. So I'm here with one of the leaders that has been building a exciting.
Let me just remind Ligia Gualpa and Antonio Solis from Los Deliveristas Unidos. you don't have to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you for the introduction. So my name is Ligia Hualpa. I'm the executive director of the Workers' Justice Project, a worker center that has been in existence for the past decade or more, actually more than a decade now. Organizing the unorganized workforce, the invisibilized workforce in the on-the-ground economy of New York City. And I'm excited not to be here alone, but I'm actually with one of the leaders that is actually reviving what the future of the labor movement, and that's Antonio. Do you want to introduce him? I'll do translation here too.
Hola, buenas tardes. Antes que nada, pues quiero agradecer que nos hayan invitado ahorita a este sitio. Es un privilegio para mí estar aquí. Y nada, mi nombre es Antonio Solís, soy mexicano, soy líder de los deliveristas unidos de Astoria, Queens. Y nada, pues quería hablarles un poco de todo cómo surgió este movimiento de los deliveristas unidos y cómo empecé yo a involucrarme en este movimiento, ¿no? Antes que nada, pues yo llegando a este país, trabajé en un restaurante y vi que pues en el transcurso del tiempo, pues éramos, más que nada nos robaban los salarios el patrón en el restaurante. Y con los compañeros pues decidimos boicotear al restaurante y salirnos de ese trabajo.
So my name is Antonio Solís. I'm one of the leaders of Los Deliveristas Unidos in Astoria. I'm from Mexico, and it's a privilege to be here with you all. And as one of the leaders, I just wanted to share how I started getting involved in the movement. And it all started when we decided to do a boycott against one of the restaurants that I was doing delivery for, after he started stealing our wages, our tips.
Y de ahí, pues, optamos la opción por trabajar en las apps, en las aplicaciones. Y nada, pues, fue donde tuvimos la necesidad vimos que no era opción más que organizarnos en las calles. Y esa fue la única opción que tuvimos nosotros como deliveristas, empezar a organizarnos en las calles.
So I left the restaurants for the apps. To work, and actually was in the streets where I find out that organizing was a necessity for me, not an option. So one of the things that happened actually, and just reflecting back, Antonio is like the perfect story of what not just app delivery workers, but workers in general are experiencing throughout New York City, throughout the United States. They're finding out that organizing is not an option anymore when corporations are underpaying and treating workers like disposable labor. That organizing is a necessity and not an option when government continues to serve corporations and the wealthy instead of serving working class people. Organizing has become the only way to be able to defend the basic rights that our past generations have fought for the basic, from a living wage, a safe working conditions, and the ability just to survive and live as working people in our cities. And it was exactly what happened during the pandemic. Workers like Antonio started realizing that while the entire country was relying on the labor of workers like deliveristas, Amazon workers, you name it, that kept not only our economy going, but actually kept all of us safe, fed, and surviving through the pandemic. And realizing that Antonio and many other workers were not even recognized as essential workers. Actually, deliveristas were most likely the only ones who were in the streets, surviving and riding their bikes, their scooters to deliver New Yorkers hot meals, New Yorkers medicine, the basics to survive. But we're dehumanized and we're invisibilized in a way that they had to find a way to organize to make themselves be heard. And it was during the pandemic that we as an organization started realizing that it wasn't just Antonio who was doing this work. There were more than 65,000 deliveristas out there organizing that were serving New York City, and organizing became their only option. And the way they did it is incredible and transformative.
Ok. Y pues gracias a todo este movimiento que hemos tenido en las calles, créeme que no ha sido fácil, no ha sido fácil para todos la pandemia, incluso para todos los que no hacemos deliveries, ha sido difícil la pandemia, ¿no? Pero bueno, gracias a todo este movimiento que hemos hecho, sin ser un sindicato, una unión, hemos logrado varias leyes que nos han ayudado a nosotros en las calles, incluso pues hemos logrado, hay un paquete de leyes para todos los deliveristas, sin ser un sindicato aún todavía. Entonces, eso quiere decir que vamos por un excelente trabajo y vamos a seguir en este camino que vamos, y creemos que vamos a lograr un sindicato para nosotros que se va a llamar Los Deliveristas Unidos, y creemos que sea pronto para que tengamos más derechos, podamos nosotros propios negociar nuestro contrato con las aplicaciones, ya que pues somos víctimas de robos de salarios, robos de tips, incluso nos accidentamos y no tenemos un patrón a quien reclamarle nosotros para decirle, ¿sabes qué? Mira, me llegó tanto de bill del hospital, no tenemos eso y estamos en camino de lograr nuestra unión y esperemos que sea pronto.
And it was because of the pandemic that we started building this movement. That without even being a formal union, we started actually acting as a union and securing some rights as deliveristas. And we are on our way to formalize and build our own union. Because at the end of the day, what we want is be able to negotiate our contract with the corporations. We want the boss to respond to our needs when we get in an accident in the workplaces. And it's because of Antonio actually started organizing. But what is important to recognize, and I was hoping Antonio to mention this, that before Workers' Justice Project started creating a safe space for them to lift up their voices, they were self-organizing in the streets already. When Workers' Justice Project started meeting Antonio and other leaders, they had built WhatsApp groups as a way to survive against bike thefts. The government, the city agencies and the government were completely ignoring that this workforce existed. When they will call the police, NYPD, to get support whenever they were being victim of bike theft or violence, their calls were ignored. And also when the apps decided to steal their tips or were giving them trashy orders with no tips, they decided even to boycott some of those deliveries. And they were using WhatsApp groups as a way of communicating. They will be in WhatsApp groups where they will share where the bike thefts were happening. When somebody got injured, they will go collectively to aid another worker when they were getting into an accident. They will call the police and try to get government support whenever they were violently attacked. The WhatsApp groups grew into larger networks that became the only way to survive in the streets. And from there, what I want to share with you is some of the organizing strategies and what the future looks like really in the labor movement. And I just want to highlight something. Workers' Justice Project is not traditionally considered a union. And we're not organizing in a traditional way. Because let's be honest, historically, the labor movement has forgotten its roots, how it got started. It has forgotten that actual labor movement started organizing immigrant workers in the past. And that's where their power and their strength really grew up. A lot of labor unions have forgotten that that's where their power continues to be, has forgotten that there's immigrant workers in our city, in our country, who are doing not only the most dangerous jobs, and they're not taking out traditionally New Yorkers or Americans' jobs. They're taking jobs that the corporations are creating actually to make all of us believe that. And what we're doing here at Worker Justice Project in Los Deliveristas Unidos, we're trying to merge that and remember the labor movement, that we're in it together. That at the end of the day, when immigrant workers organize like Antonio, confront the corporations, they're also looking and fighting for the exact same thing. The ability to have a living wage, the ability to have representation in the workplace, the ability to have a dignified life, and the ability, why not, to confront and disempower corporations like in our case, Grubhub, DoorDash, Uber, the most powerful and wealthy corporations who are profiting not only out of immigrants, but working class people, because delivery is not just done by immigrant workers, it's done by New Yorkers whose these have become the jobs that they have relied to survive.
Por último, lo que sigue para nosotros este año que viene, es un salario mínimo de, nosotros lo pedimos con nuestros gastos que tenemos en operaciones, en reparamiento de nuestras herramientas de trabajo, de $30 por hora. Es lo mínimo que nosotros estamos pidiendo. Y creemos que es poco, pero bueno, no queremos también pedir tanto. Y nada, quisiera pedirles que se pusieran de pie. Quisiera brindarle un aplauso a todos mis compañeros que pues han fallecido, que han perdido la vida en este trabajo tan difícil que es hacer un delivery, ¿verdad?
So, right now, what's next for us is that we're trying to fight for a minimum wage of $30 an hour. And I know that's what we're asking for right now. To be able, right now also I want to ask you all to stand up and to give a round of applause to all my comrades that have actually died doing this work in the streets. So
yeah, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. So
Thank you.
with that being end, I just want to highlight some of the lessons learned and what actually talking about what's next for the labor movement, right? So some lessons learned is exactly what Antonio mentioned. They have built incredible power to move, to create masses of mobilizations in the streets. So it's actually this past year that they were able to show that they have power and voice by mobilizing over 4,000 deliveristas to the streets 2 times, one in 2020, the other one in 2021. The other thing is they forced city council members to listen to them. And that was powerful to see city council members sit down and write legislation based on what they wanted, not based on what city council members wanted to see. The third one is that they understood that the power they had when they mobilized thousands to the streets. What they're doing right now is they're growing their bases using technology, because they know the power of technology because they're seeing it day by day when they use. So they're right now, they're in the pathway to build actually their own infrastructure system in technology to be able to mobilize, communicate, and respond, and being able to build power using technology. But one of the things, incredible power things that they have been able to do is exactly what Marisa has been mentioning, how we connect the movements, right? And they're understanding that this is not just a labor movement. This is an environmental issue, and they understand it very well because they're the ones who are doing this work actually on the government is telling that there's no way to shift transportation and travel our city in a greener environmental way, they're doing it already. That's how New York City's economy survived. The other one is redesigning transportation. They're working with transportation groups to make sure that when we're redesigning, we're thinking that we include the voices of working class people. And that's exactly what we're doing right now at this point. So yes, the labor movement looks exciting, but it's because of workers who are on the front lines building that power. And it is possible. And the commitment is not to build just short-term solutions and movements, but long-term. And the only way to do it is we ensure workers have the space, the resources to continue building that power in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Leah and Antonio. That's terrific. And our final speaker for the day is Professor Andrew Ross.
Thank you, Summer, my fellow panelists. This is an awesome panel to be on, I have to say. And thank you to Paula for 25 years of service. You'll be dearly missed. And to all of those who wielded an editorial pen at the Journal, it's never been just a journal, of course, it's a forum, and that's very important. Forum for debate and ideas and arguments and opinions that have been really indispensable to the labor movement. So I'm very proud of the contributions I've been able to make, and it's my favorite journal to write for. My job here is to tell you about a new kind of union, a debtors union, which owes a lot to the long traditions of the labor movement, but has emerged in response to conditions of financial capitalism, rampant financialization. So why do we need debtors unions? We know we're living in an era when there's an alarming number of households and municipalities and sovereign nations that are drowning in debt, debt that will never be repaid, but debt that will be generating scads of revenue for the creditor class for far longer than the profits that are being extracted from services and manufactured goods. Lifelong financial extraction is a preferred model of capital accumulation in this kind of economy. I call it a creditocracy. It's an economy in which every social good and in fact, every commodity can be transformed into a debt-financed asset, which then generates an income stream for the creditor. Small items, you need a new battery for your car, you need a new set of wheels for your car, you can get that financed. Big ticket items, cars themselves, the average monthly car loan payment is now a whopping $700. And that doesn't even begin to include insurance. And then, of course, there's that very are told they have to have for their kids if their kids are going to avoid being stuck in dead-end jobs. With indebtedness comes powerlessness. And whether you're talking about your national elected officials who have to prioritize debt service to foreign banks over and above the social needs of their own citizenry, or whether we're talking about low-income households that are struggling to, juggle their smaller debt payments to smaller creditors. For all of them, the experience of being deeply in debt servitude places very heavy constraints on our political imagination and our political mobility. The solution to this predicament is something we all know about. It's collective organizing and it's collective action, which leads to empowerment and gives us leverage at the bargaining table. And that's why You know, trade unions were so sorely needed in the heyday of industrialization, when struggle over wages was a frontline conflict. So too today, debtors unions are sorely needed in the age of financialization, when the struggle over economic rents is a frontline conflict, and when the creditor class is extracting profits from the social factory far beyond the walls of the workplace. I'm not meaning to suggest that wage conflict is over. It never will be, but it has been reconfigured in the age of finance. And let me put it very bluntly, debts are the wages of the future. When you sign a loan, you're basically promising your future wages, right? Far in advance of the labor that you will be performing to earn those wages. And while the door is always open, the creditor's door is always open to individuals to go in and restructure your debt and, you know, consolidate and renegotiate your debts for individuals. But we only have real power when we go through that door together. That's why debtors unions are needed, to leverage the collective power of debts and to stop the lords of finance from siphoning off all of our earnings. So the first organization of this kind already exists. It's called the Debt Collective. I was one of the co-founders in 2014. And in the years since then, it has established itself as a force that can deliver results and also project influence onto mainstream policy making. All of the recent pressure on Sleepy Joe Biden to deliver student debt cancellation, for example, a lot of that was spearheaded by the Debt Collective and its allies, its proven ability to deliver debt relief and also to enlist the support of key elected officials as allies. The Debt Collective had two predecessor groups, Occupy Student Debt Campaign and Strike Debt. I don't have time to describe them here, but some of you might remember Strike Debt's mutual aid project called the Rolling Jubilee, which we raised money from small donations, and we bought a ton of debt on the secondary debt market for pennies on the dollar, which you can do, and then simply abolished it. In the years since then, we've used that instrument on several occasions, and we've managed to abolish several $100 million worth of debt, medical debt, carceral debt, most recently school lunch debt, and we're working on auto debt deficiency, auto loan deficiency debt. The kinds of debt that just shouldn't exist in this world, in other words. Unlike these other previous organizations, the Debt Collective was founded explicitly as a debtors union. And so we decided to start from the ground up and build this thing from a small group. We decided to target a common, a creditor in common, a large creditor in common, the Department of Education. So we organized a group of student debtors from low-income households who'd been to for-profit colleges. They mounted a high-profile debt strike, and then we found this little notice provision in the Higher Education Act, which guaranteed a debt discharge to all student debtors who had been misled or scammed by their college. So we helped tens and thousands of student debtors to file borrower defense claims. And over the years, we've managed to get several $1 billion worth of debt relief for those debtors using these claims. Now, when the Biden administration came to power, we set ourselves a larger target, much larger target, which was $1.7 trillion worth of aggregate student debt, and have been using a variety of tactics to pursue that goal over the last few years. Old and new media weaponry, the clout of well-situated allies inside the Beltway, arguments and knowledge accumulated from 10 years of debtor organizing, and also the use of small-scale strikes as a fair warning of the potential power of tens of millions debtors participating in larger scale strikes. So I should mention, I want to just point out that although Sleepy Joe Biden went for the barest possible minimal amount of debt to cancel in his recent executive order, it still amounts to the largest household debt jubilee in American history, and would have been unthinkable until the efforts of activists made it politically unavoidable for Joe Biden, for whom debt cancellation went against every political bone in his body. So these efforts and these successful efforts to win debt relief are proof of concept for us. Proof of concept that collective action can actually produce results. Organizationally, we have several chapters in a variety of cities. We have several thousand members, many of whom pay dues. We do a lot of political education work through our Jubilee schools. But the strength of the union does not depend on member density. And with this kind of union, it probably never will. It's a different kind of union in that regard. Organizing around debt is not like organizing around wages or organizing around rents. Unlike workers, debtors don't have a common workplace where they can establish relationships of trust with one another. And unlike tenants, they don't have neighbors with whom they have relationships of familiarity and can build solidarity. So traditional modes of organizing don't work so well or in the same way. That said, there are some financial contracts where the creditor in common is a well-known entity, is deeply resented, and is easily targeted as a result. I would say also that debt strikes and mass refusals of payments are just as powerful in the court of public opinion as withdrawal of labor or the withholding of rents. And lastly, when we're talking about liability, financial liability, you might think, yes, of course, owing billions of dollars of debt is a huge liability, but what if we were able to leverage those debts collectively, not just to win relief, but also to help dismantle the neoliberal infrastructure of user-financed social goods, which has gotten us to this point in the first place. John Paul Getty used to say, the banker, he should know, he used to say that if you owe the bank $100, then that's your problem. But if you owe the bank $100 million, that's the bank's problem. So there's a lot of latent power there to be tapped, and we haven't even begun to do it yet. The potential for that, it seems to me, to be immense and colossal in scope. Now, winning debt relief is all very well. It is good. It relieves hardship. It allows people to start over again, but it does not stop the clock of accumulation. The debt keeps piling up, and debt is only a symptom in that regard. It's not the root cause of the problem. To get to the root cause of the problem, we need to definancialize social goods like education and housing and healthcare, and yes, transportation, which is also a social good. And that's why we've also been active in helping to draft College for All legislation, and we recently launched organizing campaigns in carceral debt, medical debt, and housing debt. So we hope to be active in helping to draft legislation and also lobby for housing for all and Medicare for all and transportation for all, a movement that doesn't yet exist but should, in my opinion. Last thing I want to say is, because I'm almost out of time, is I want to address the working class in the title of this symposium. Debt is something that the working class have a very intimate familiarity with and always have had. debt has been used to deepen labor exploitation. The days of slavery, indenture, sharecropping, all the way up to the current day, when we have widespread bonded labor of migrant workers, where we have payday lending and other forms of poverty banks, and prison labor, and so on and so forth. The experience of taking out new loans in order to service old loans has also been a chronic experience for working class people. It's a scourge of working class life. The difference is, in the last few decades, we've seen this experience march up into the middle classes and affect a much larger mass of the population. And unfortunately, or maybe fortuitously, that's the point at which it attracts a lot of media attention, right? When it hits the middle class and a lot of public scrutiny. That has sometimes bizarre consequences. In response to the recent student debt cancellation, the executive order, we heard a chorus of voices on the right and in the center, and even from voices on the left who should have known better, who said in response that this was a handout to well-heeled families who really didn't need the relief, right? Despite the fact that it was pretty obvious the vast majority of the beneficiaries of that executive order will be from low-income households, and they will be disproportionately Black, Brown, and Indigenous. That is the case with student debt. It's also the case with all the other debt classes I've mentioned today. Working class people have the most to gain from challenging the concentrated power of finance and the elected officials who do its bidding. And those gains are something that we have to keep in mind and in focus as we, this panel is about the future of labor, right? Not the future of work, which is a favorite TED Talk topic, but the future of labor. We have to keep those concerns in the forefront of our efforts to build cross-class campaigns. And these are the most difficult campaigns really to build, but cross-class campaigns are what we need. And I hope that our Debtors Union initiative can be part of that. So thank you.
Well, thanks again. Let's give one more round of applause. He's terrific. I think we'll have, can we do them same? I think we've got about 20 minutes, 15, 20 minutes, last 10 minutes, 10 minutes. Oh, okay. We can take a few questions. So Zoom, in person, I can walk around with a mic unless someone else is going to do that. We can bounce back and forth. So anyone who's not all at once. Yeah, over here. And I think because so that the online people can hear you.
Hi, I can't hear if it's on. It's working. Yep. Yep. Hello? There,
Yeah.
now it's working. Okay. Yeah, so thank you all for the presentations. They're very informative. In many cases, you were describing types of organizing, which are like, in some sense, like very traditional and very foundational, but like are kind of outside like what we might call the traditional scope of the labor movement. So I was wondering if you all had like, thoughts about like the ways you would want to collaborate with like the traditional labor movement, like your demands or asks of them. And then in any cases, if they've responded, if they've helped or refused to help, If you could describe any experiences with that.
I could just start us off if I can, like just in terms of the big picture. And I want to touch on Amazon. I'm sure that's top of mind for many. What's happening with ALU, what's happening with the Amazon United, and there's a lot of Amazon worker organizing efforts across the country. And within that, you have unions that are looking to organize those workers and have been for many years, even before ALU was successful in their efforts here in New York. I can share that, you have Teamsters Union, for example, RWDSU. Teamsters, for folks who might not know, represents a lot of the workforce in the delivery, last mile delivery services, trucking companies, that's all that kind of work that is logistics. RWDSU represents a lot of workers in the retail unions and have been organizing in Alabama, if you're following the effort. So those are two unions that have been working on this. And then ALU organized those workers in Staten Island, right? First, I would say, being in the midst of this is in the time where we were working back in 2019. I'm gonna just go back to that time. Do you all remember HQ2? If you were in New York City, Amazon wanted to open their headquarters in Long Island City, big fight. It's a lot to talk and unpack around that, but one of the biggest things is that many of those groups came together for that fight with different interests and different strategies in mind. So that united that force to be able to come together between those two traditional unions. Now with ALU, there is an effort to really come together to think about how do we work in collaboration, not only in New York State, but across the country, and what that collaboration can look like. And that was something that was unthinkable in some moments because there was always the tension, and I still hear this a lot. ALU is doing something different, and the traditional labor unions aren't really catching up, right? That has been some narrative that I've been hearing a lot. But the truth is that there is something to be learned from each other. And a lot of the strategies all come down to like the deep relationships that organizers have with workers. And that's where it starts. So it's not so different, but in terms of how the people can collaborate with each other is the different part. What I'm hoping we will get to a point where there is less confrontation about who takes the jurisdiction of what type of work, but rather, as Stephen was talking about earlier, how do we organize the entire sector in a collaborative way? And there are some active conversations taking place on that. And I've seen some good outcome out of that.
¿Puedo decir algo? ¿Se escucha? Bueno, nosotros ¿cómo me tradujo mi compañera? Bueno, el sistema que nosotros nos organizamos o el modo que nos organizamos, bueno, es muy bueno porque de hecho para formar el sindicato nos acercamos al TW y al 32BJ, los sindicatos que están ahorita ahí. Nos acercamos a ellos, nos dijeron su propuesta, y bueno, nosotros decidimos, pues, y de hecho ellos nos dijeron, ¿saben qué? Pues mejor, piénsenlo bien, vean cuáles son las opciones. Pero nosotros decidimos que no nos uniéramos a ellos porque sentimos que íbamos a perder nuestra identidad como deliveristas unidos. No íbamos a tomar nosotros nuestras decisiones como trabajadores, íbamos a depender de otro sindicato que decidimos que no nos íbamos a unir a ellos porque, bueno, íbamos a perder todo lo que hemos logrado en estos años.
Actually, the way we started organizing was actually, he didn't mention this part, was actually with support of two labor unions. That's the Transportation Workers United, the International, and 32BJ, who were actively supporting the advocacy work that we were doing. I think it's important to mention that, but I'll expand on it. So what he was saying is that the way he started organizing is also by approaching TWU and 32BJ specifically. And we started discussing their proposals. and what they had to offer to us as we were organizing. And we decided that we'll go on our own to try to form our own independent union, because we felt that we would lose our identity as Los Libristas Unidos, and we wouldn't have full control of our decisions as our approach. And that's what he said. Just to expand on it, I think there's a lot work to still be done, right, in terms of how we build that collaboration with traditional labor, especially talking about workers who are organizing not in a traditional way. And when I want to say that, I just want to clarify. I think I agree with Maritza in terms of, it's all about how we connect and how workers connect with each other and are able to build that level of power and leverage to confront the companies. I think what changes are the strategies as how we do that, right? So, and I think there's a lot work ahead to be done to feel like how we continue to build those strategies in a way that it's inclusive. Workers have more control of their organizing strategies. And that's exactly, I think, what Los Libristas were having deeper conversations with two unions who were very open. And I think I want to applaud this, because TWU and 32BJ were super committed to understanding what they really wanted it, right? And it was also interesting to see even TWU, whom actually made I remember this was John from the International Laborers Union, actually advising them, actually saying, I think what you guys want is actually go independent. And I'll be proud to support that strategy, because that's exactly what you guys are looking for. And I think labor movement is understanding too that things need to be done differently, but they also are understanding that there is a different road to take in terms of how we get things, and that they're willing to stand on the side of workers on how to do that. And I think that's exactly what TWU and 32BJ have been doing. And there's a lot of work ahead to be done, right? So it's a work in progress as how we labor movement continues to building that path to build it stronger, because at the end of the day is the goal is the same. It's just how you get there.
Hello. On the question of the relationship to the mainstream labor movement, I mean, as far as our debtors initiative goes, for reasons that I think I tried to explain, debtors unions are in many ways an extension of the labor movement. We don't see them as an inevitable next step, but they are a response to shifts in the practice of profiteering on the part of the capitalist class. And so specifically, I suppose, because we've mostly focused on education debt, we worked most closely with education unions so far. And I actually was reminded, it's too bad Adolf is not here, but Adolf Reed was one of the founders of the Labor Party back in the early 1990s. And Adolf in particular put tuition-free college and an abolition of student debt up there as one of the major planks of the Labor Party, and did a lot of sort of canvassing and lobbying around that issue on the premise that there's no working class household where parents would not want their kids to go to a tuition-free college, quality tuition-free college. That should be a no-brainer. That should be very high on the list of priorities. But of course, we're not just interested in education, we're interested in all of these social goods that have been turned over to user financing in the era of financialization. And it occurs to me that I mean, I think the way I could frame this is about the difference between business unionism and social unionism. There was a vision of social unionism and a practice of social unionism earlier in the 20th century, where for members, all of these social goods could be provided for under the umbrella of a trade union. Housing, unions in this city built masses of housing, had their own banks talking about financing, certain forms of healthcare, a whole range of amenities, including recreational activities. All of these social goods that were then taken up in a very partial way by our government, by the state, and given a sort of half-assed effort of providing them in the post-war period, and then turned over under neoliberalism to the forces of privatization. These used to be things that unions provided, and got out of the business of doing so when business unionism became the dominant model. And so in some ways, I guess, if I had to think given a long historical view about this, I see debtors unions in a way as sort of remedying a first step remedy towards recreating that world of social unionism under different conditions, under different circumstances, of course. So.
I think
Hi, what a wonderful panel. Some of my questions actually have been answered by these responses, but I did want to say that I really love the framing of this panel, looking 40 years into the future. I find it a little worrisome that there's no one from a traditional union on the panel. So I wonder if there's maybe an unintentional comment on, will traditional unions be able to reinvent themselves to be there 40 years from now? But aside from that, I very much had this question about new organizational forms, right? Alternatives to existing unions. So I really appreciate the answers you've provided so far. Maritza, you ended on a note of saying you saw some collaborations which gave you hope. And I was wondering if you could say more about the collaborations you see on the horizon.
Sure. I mean, a lot of this work is in the works. So I don't imagine I can just speak to specific examples at the moment. But I can say that, you know, we did have a nice event not too long ago. We have our fundraising event a few weeks ago. And at this event, we have workers from ALU getting an award, recognizing their leadership and the courage that they had to take on this big corporation. And similarly, at the same time, we have workers from Alabama who were organized, or at least a committee that was organizing with our WDSU. In the midst of working towards that event, where we were going to have two different groups who in some point saw differently and had not been able to like connect, you know, there were conversations taking place there, hugs. There were moments of like, hey, let's figure out a way where we can connect and really think about how do we take on this work. And here is where Align comes in, right? Like I want to just share that Align is as the name calls it, aligned. We're trying to align the movement. I don't know if that will ever happen completely, but our effort here is how do we align the forces right now so that we can fight this large corporation with more power, right? So we were able to just discuss some of these strategies and ideas with these two forces, with the unions who are organizing with ALU, with the workers, and with the president of the union with our WDSU, who also sits in the Align board, about the possibilities of starting to have a conversation about the sharing of strategies and when and how, to your point, like when and how we move together if we want to move together. But having a parallel understanding on the strategies, I think that's the first step. And I think that's where many people are wanting to move, regardless, because we don't have to be all on top of each other. There is a way to coordinate, have parallel strategies, and also have more creative innovations of seeing each other in ways of, you know, as humans, right? Like it's not about the institution itself, it's that we all want the same things. Just like Ligia mentioned, we all want the end goal And sometimes we just have to step back and see that big picture. And when people get to that point, I think then we are able to just overcome some of those polarizations that, politically are the ones that are trying to drag us down. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, I think. Oh, yeah, Andrew, yeah, please. Anyone else?
I'm tempted to say this in response, but one way of framing your question would be, at what point will alt labor no longer be alt? That it's not an alternative and it's just labor. And I think folks in the audience might have different answers to that, might have a different chronology or a different sense of when to predict that would happen. But if you take, again, the long historical view, there was a time when organizing industrial workers was alt labor. It was considered alternative to, the craft union model. And as we know, industrial organizing delivered this sort of massive chunk of power to the labor movement in the 1930s and 1940s. But that was not on the cards. It was not predicted. It was not historically inevitable at the moment. In retrospect, of course, these things are. But perhaps, the most hopeful or optimistic thing I could say would be that alt labor may turn out to deliver that kind of labor power in ways that we can't quite imagine at this point in time. But this is the future of labor panels, so we're allowed to imagine that.
So we are pushing up on time, but we did get a question from a student, I believe. So it has to be answered. So this is kind of building on the spirit of the last question, and I think it's a nice way to close. And so maybe we can just work through the panel, starting with Ligia and Antonio, and then moving forward. The question is basically about the number of workers that are left out of labor law right now, domestic workers, independent contractors, and so on. And the student asks, what's the benefit of amending the National Labor Relations Act or other labor laws to unionize more workers? And I guess the way I would put it is, how do we think, and how are each of you thinking about, given the sectors in which you're organizing, the workers and with various classifications that you're organizing, how are you thinking about organizing in the context of a very difficult political and legal environment in which we already are facing and which we might continue to face going forward? Yeah, sorry, I should have. Yeah, why don't we start?
I'm just going through the pieces. Okay, you want to pick it up?
Oh, why?
No? Okay.
Well, I was just thinking about the origins of our movement were in the Occupy Wall Street, and at that time, as I'm sure many of you know, the Occupy culture was not only don't make demands on electeds, but don't even speak to electeds, don't even speak to NGOs. The emphasis was on self-organization and counter power, and over the years, I guess, some groups have stuck with that model, and our debtor organizing movement went in a different direction, and we established a lot of relationships with elected officials inside the Beltway, which was sort of astonishing to many of us who had shared that history, and discovered that there were ways of having one foot inside and one foot outside, and using that kind of strategy of power to put pressure on elected officials, while at the same time, preserving the threat of mass action or other forms of direct action. So it's a kind of roundabout way of addressing the question, which is to say we're still feeling our way within the proto-legislative process, and so far so good.
I mean, my best attempt to answer this question would be to understand that, in the regulatory systems, it's very difficult right now. That's whoever asked that question, that's totally right. Now, in order for a movement to function, in order for the labor movement to be able to just meet the moment, I think for me, it is important to think about how are we collaborating with each other. I mean, it seems like an easy thing to do, except that there is too many interests, individual interests taking place in the labor movement as a whole. It's like, this is my campaign, this is my job, this is my members, and not seeing the issue that it's at hand right now as like, this is a problem for all of our workers and all of our members in our communities, right? So I think shifting the approach to this work in a more intersectional way, I think will help to tackle the moment. And specifically in the context of workers who have been excluded, I think there is a lot of momentum, particularly federally. There are discussions right now about how do we make sure that workers who have been recognized as members of this community, as citizens in the community, but have been part of the community, can access the same income levels, the same protections that all workers have, because at the end of the day, regardless of any kind of immigration status, we know that the workers have, regardless of that, the same exact rights, right? So I think starting with that, and engaging, I would say, the labor unions in that conversation more actively, because at the end of the day, somebody was asking, I think, or making the point about like, what's the alternative if we don't actually organize the current workforce that is majority, as much as we may, not be able to see it, majority immigrant and new immigrant folks, then the density will continue to go down. And that is something to recognize. And lastly, regulatory systems are only important if we have a collective power behind it. And government can only do what we tell them what to do if we elect the right people. And that is fundamentally the thing that we always talked about. Elections are important, but they become important if we elect people who are not going to be, at the very least, tackling the current crises that workers are faced with, particularly workers who are and have been excluded. And that has to be a priority number one for anyone who is getting elected this time around.
Bueno, como entendí la pregunta aquí, bueno, para nosotros, los deliveristas, ha sido un poco más complicado porque no tenemos un patrón al que estemos viendo todos los días. Es un patrón virtual y ha sido difícil pues que nos clasifiquen como trabajadores. Como te mencioné, no tenemos un patrón al quien le tenemos que responder más que al teléfono. Y eso es la lucha, ¿no? Formar nuestro propio sindicato para nosotros presionar a las aplicaciones a que tengamos un seguro de vida, tengamos más beneficios para nosotros, y nos volteen a ver que somos esenciales, ¿no? Así nos conocieron en la pandemia, mientras que todos estaban encerrados en sus casas, nosotros salíamos a las calles a hacer el trabajo, ¿no? Entonces, es lo que estamos pidiendo ahorita nosotros, como que seamos trabajadores, que tengamos más derechos, y es nuestra pelea de todos los días con las aplicaciones.
This is a complex question because of our reality. We have a virtual boss in this case, and sometimes it's just somebody on the phone. And our fight is actually that, to form our own union, to pressure the companies so they can give us more benefits, sometimes even health insurance. And because at the end of the day, while, everybody was at home and staying safe, we were the only ones in the streets. And that's our fight to have even more rights as workers. I think what is complex is organizing in this new political environment, when more workers, the economy is shifting. That's the reality.
And deliveristas are just a perfect example of that, right? Actually, Antonio just shared that before he became an app deliverista, he was a restaurant deliverista. And when he was at the restaurant, he was actually a worker. He had rights. He had protections. But despite those rights, Antonio was still facing exploitation. His tips, his wage were still stolen. He was actually treated less than human being. They were prevented from having lunch breaks and eating even food, and were being asked to pay for the food they ate at the restaurant. And when he went out in the streets to work at the app, boycotting on the employer, as he said, he did it because he was fed up with that. To turn out that things improved, but he was stripping away for rights that he had. So what I'm trying to say here is more workers are going into gig work. That's the reality. And the economy and corporations have found this loophole in a way that they can continue to profit from the labor without offering protections. And the real issue here is how we redefine workers' rights and protections for workers in more expansive way. The fight can't just be to retain the title of workers as workers. I think the fight has to be how we expand protections and guarantee those protections for workers. And that's the problem. I feel like, I'm just going to be honest and transparent. When we're asked this question, I feel like even the labor movement and allies are like, do you guys want to reclassify as workers or not? Like, what's the answer? And sometimes I think workers are also pushed to the side. We're like, well, when we were workers, it's not like we had rights. So, and there's a lot of work to bring people, you said the labor movement, to have a real conversation. Like, what's the real fight here? Like, we're fighting just to be reclassified as workers, or we're fighting to expand protections and expand the ability for workers' right to have worker representation, expand the ability to strategize about how we unionize and organize the unorganized and the ones that are ununionized. And how we build, as you said, like a cross-collaboration movement where we're not antagonizing each other because we disagree with the traditional and powerful labor movement, but we're come in a clear and honest conversation, how we move forward using our disagreements as leverage to build something different and something unique and something powerful. And that's the work that is ahead to be done. And that's what we're going to keep on trying to bring labor movement to have a conversation by staying silent and saying, let's redefine our fight. We're not going to just take our answer to whether we're workers or not, just to continue to operate in the same framework. We have to reinvent. We have to reimagine. We have to redefine our future and the future of labor. And that's what is at stake. I'm just going to leave it there.
Right. That's a perfect way to end. Thank you so much, all four of our panelists and the three that came before, and Paula and everyone. And there's some wine and beer, I think, over there. So let's, I look forward to hanging out.